Order. It looks like we have quorum among PSC commissioners. So I'll start off as usual with, in keeping with Oregon Public Meeting Law, statutory land use hearing requirements, and Title 33 of the Portland City Code, the Portland Planning and Sustainability Commission is holding this meeting virtually. All members of the PSC are attending remotely, and the city has made several avenues available for the public to watch the broadcast of this meeting. The PSC is taking these steps as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic and the need to limit in-person contact and promote social distancing. The pandemic is an emergency that threatens the public health, safety, and welfare, which requires us to meet remotely by electronic communications. Thank you for your patience, humor, flexibility, and understanding as we manage through this difficult situation to do the city's business. And with that, I will switch over to items of interest from commissioners. I'm not hearing a specific item of interest, but I wanted to volunteer that this is Indigenous Peoples Day, yesterday was. So the city has not yet come up with a standard opening to our meetings to appreciate the land on which we live and those who've been here before us. But the city did just adopt a resolution that we passed, and maybe I can hear out from Andrea. Was it a recent city council vote to do this? I'm not sure the timing.
Yes, I believe it was. Okay. And just to let folks know that the land acknowledgement, we expect to have that developed. The tribal liaison office is working on that, and we expect to have that done by early next year. So I think there's an interest from PSC members to incorporate that in the opening of our meetings, which we can do once we receive that. Yes, we would. And although now noting the holiday yesterday, I would like to give a moment for people if they'd like to share how the history of this land could inform the work we do at the PSC. So does anyone want to share a thought on that?
It looks like Katie has her hand raised. Okay,
I'm sorry. Let me put my screen so I can see who's got their hand up. Katie, thank you.
Oh, I'm sorry. I actually, that's a big question you just asked, and I'm not really prepared for it, although I could see it having a big, I just wanted to tell you that I might be having to leave at 2:30. So I'm responding to the earlier thing, just to let you know that. But I think that one of the things about saying those kinds of, I'm not sure what they're called, but just sort of a preamble, is just to remind us that we need to take care of the land and in a more holistic way than we sometimes do.
Oriana and then Mike.
Yeah, I think this is a really important conversation to have, and I'm really glad to hear that the city is working on a land acknowledgement and working through some of the sensitive issues with regard to questions about whose land it is between tribes, and also just acknowledging dispersed Indigenous communities in the Portland area who are very present. I think sometimes land acknowledgements are very focused on the past and this idea of whose land it used to be, as opposed to acknowledging that present experience of Indigenous communities. But I think this is of particular importance to me, that we figure out how to thoughtfully integrate a land acknowledgement into our practice, and in general, encourage the BPS to have staff acknowledge Indigenous experiences or whose land different projects are a part of in their work. Because the reality is we are talking about property lines and zoning code that are superimposed over land that has been stolen and is not ours. So that's always something I feel a little bit uncomfortable with being in these PSC spaces, is that we're not acknowledging that fact, that we're making these arbitrary decisions on land that has been harmed historically and has belonged to communities through sustainable practices since time immemorial. So those are just some reflections today, and I hope we'll continue to engage in this in the way that we've engaged with other questions of equity and justice in this work, and are willing to push ourselves to be a little bit uncomfortable and maybe make some mistakes in terms of how we address this. But I think it's important that we do address this and don't pretend like land use and zoning are removed from this history of colonialism and white supremacy and racism and extreme harm that's been done in the name of creating the property boundaries and zoning that we defend in this space.
I think you just said me.
I said Steph, and Mike had his hand up too, and I thought that he'd put a blue hand up and took it down again. So we'll go Steph and then Mike. Sorry.
Okay. Well, just very quickly, I think it's perhaps serendipitous that you asked this question on the day that we are talking about the Historic Code Resources Project. I think it's interesting. We should be considering, when does our history that we are preserving start? That's all that.
Mike.
Well, all of the natural resource decisions we're making relate directly to this topic. I know Judy Bluehorse-Skelton at PSU Indigenous Nations Studies Program has been doing a lot of work with both the Portland Parks and Recreation and Metro doing projects on indigenous foods, principally on Wapato with Metro. So all of our discussions about climate change, about adaptation, mitigation relate to this topic.
Thank you.
Focusing on natural vegetation and vegetation that's important to indigenous peoples.
Mm-hmm. Okay. With that, let's transition to Andrea for a director's report.
Good afternoon, everyone. Nice to see you. Couple of updates to share. One is that for the recruitment for our open positions on the Planning and Sustainability Commission, we've received applications for the youth position, and we're moving forward with interviewing candidates for that. Thank you very much, Ben, for participating in the interview committee for that. And we have extended the application period to November 20th for the other positions. So I really encourage everybody to expand your outreach to your networks, encourage people to apply, and we're hoping to have more candidates to review and consider after November 20th. So just, we'll keep you updated on that. Good news to share on the legal front. We wanted to let you know that residential infill project was not appealed. So that will move forward without appeal, which we're very excited about. Similarly, Central City was not appealed. It's out of the appeal period as well. And the comp plan was not remanded. So we're now back to our original order to certify the comp plan. So we've tackled some major hurdles on the legal front and moved some important legislative packages forward. So wanted to share that good news and really want to appreciate our staff who've worked very hard to document and make sure that we have strong findings in those packages. And then upcoming calendar items, wanted to let you know that tree code will go to council on October 29th, scheduled for 1 p.m. And Eli will be there to present the PSC letter. So thank you, Eli, for that. And then River Plan South Reach will start at council on November 4th, and that's scheduled for 2 p.m. So if anyone wants to tune into that, we'll start that process then.
And I think Mike Houck will be presenting that one to City Council.
Okay, great. Great. Excellent.
I had one question on the recruitment. We have 3 esteemed long-term members of the PSC who will be ending their terms in early 2021. Will the city draw from the same pool for those seats? And if so, people should do outreach thinking that it may be not just the current seats, but additional ones coming up.
Exactly. Yes. We hope to draw from the same pool and not have to do major recruitment again. So even more reason to think broadly and long-term about the kinds of skill sets and people that we can bring on to the commission.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
We'll move now to the consent agenda. And we've got consideration of the minutes, and we also have a proposed vacation not too far from where I live here in Northeast Portland, 27th and Holland Street. So would anyone like to pull anything from consent? Okay, if not, would someone like to make a motion?
Move adoption of the consent agenda.
Thank you, Chris. Is there a second?
Second.
So thank you, Steph. All in favor, raise your real or virtual hands, and I'll check a look around. Okay, we're getting a mix. How can I even do this? Looks like it's unanimous. Thank you, everybody. So the consent agenda passes, and with that, we will shift to a new topic for us, the Historic Resources Code Project. There was a time when a few commissioners met with staff and members of the Historic Commission I guess it was a long time ago, to look at an earlier version of this project, but this is the first time it's in front of the PSC. So I'd like to welcome, I believe it's going to be Brandon presenting. So Brandon Spencer Hartle, and I will hand the baton to you, and maybe let us know how you would like us to handle questions, whether you'd like us to interject as you go, or raise hands, or hold them for the end. Give us a little guidance on that, but welcome to the PSC.
Thanks for having me, Chair Spivak and Commissioners. I will let Sandra Wood do the introductions here, and we'll share my screen so we can track along, and we'll give you a quick run of show in the beginning about where it is that we would like you to go today. And I'm sorry, I have to tab back through here.
That sounds good.
Second.
Okay. Thanks, Brandon, and thanks, Commissioner Spivak. I'm Sandra Wood. I'm with the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability. I'm the Code Development and Urban Design Manager. And Brandon Spencer Hartle and I are here to brief you on the Historic Resources Code project. This is a legislative project. So what we were going to be embarking upon is amendments to the zoning code. There are no map amendments, but the map is already embedded in the zoning map and part of this project. So you'll be holding a public hearing in 2 weeks, and this is your briefing so that you know what the public is testifying about. And then eventually you'll be making a recommendation to City Council. And we estimate you'll be working on this project for about 4 to 5 meetings long. So similar to other projects, not as long as DOZA or residential infill, but around the 4 to 5 meeting mark. The last time the PSC considered amendments to the Historic Resources chapters of the zoning code was a small project in 2013. So it's been a while that you have taken some time to look at these regulations. The main driver behind this project that we're bringing you is that the state changed their admin rules, and that necessitates us to change our code. And we'll get into that later and give you some context around that. Brandon's been working really closely with the Bureau of Development Services and the Historic Landmarks Commission on the amendments over 2 previous periods of public outreach. And he's been to this commission a couple of times, once during concept development and once during the discussion draft. We're not expecting you to necessarily remember the ins and outs of all of that, so we'll cover it today. We have an hour and a half on today's agenda, and we wanted to divide it into 2 parts. The first part is about the Historic Resources Program overall. This is just about, like, if we were just keeping the lights on, what would the historic resources work that our Bureau is doing? What does that look like? And in addition to that, what's the context, the state context and the federal context behind that? So we'll go over that in about 20 minutes. And then, so if you could hold your questions to the end of that time period, and then we can have a little bit of time for questions. And hopefully by like 1:15, we can move on to the proposal, which is the second part of the agenda. And that's actually what you'll be spending the bulk of your work on. We think we can do that in about 30 minutes and then 15 minutes for Q&A. And that should prepare you well for hearing the testimony in a couple weeks. So let me, with that, I have to say Brandon is the expert on all of this. I'm just helping him along and adding a different voice in the presentation, because we know it's a lot to be hearing the same voice throughout the project. So most of your questions will be answered by him. So with no further ado, let me introduce Brandon Spencer Hartle. Most of you know him. He is the Bureau's Historic Resource Program Manager. He has a graduate degree in historic preservation, has been working on historic resource issues statewide for over a decade. As you'll see, he's very, very passionate about historic resources. He's a renter of a duplex in historic districts, so he's literally lives and breathes historic resources. Before I turn it over to him, why don't I'm not sure if any commissioners would like to disclose any potential conflicts of interest if you live in a historic district or in a historic landmark, or if you are a renter in one of those districts or own commercial property, you might want to consider disclosing that at this point. Eli, your mic is off. I think Commissioner Spivak's trying to say something, but his mic is off.
That took me a little while. Sorry about that. My screen
That's okay.
jumped between screens. Well, thanks for the prompt. I wanted to say I don't have a conflict on this, but if you're a commissioner, you don't know whether you're in a conservation or historic district, then send your address to staff and they'll help you figure it out before our next meeting. So we'll provide an additional opportunity then.
Yeah.
Thanks.
And I don't see any hands raised, so I will go ahead and continue moving on. But that's one of, so with that, I'll turn it over to Brandon.
Well, thanks, Sandra, and hello again, commissioners. Staff gave me a perfect introduction to what I had planned to say first, which was recognizing yesterday as Indigenous Peoples Day. As the project manager for the Historic Resource Code project, I'd be remiss in starting this presentation without recognizing that the vast majority of our city's previous experience with historic resources, both designation of resources, the types of resources that are considered for historic resource status, and the procedures and criteria in place have largely told a white dominant story. That story has largely told a upper and upper middle class white Portland story. And so the context that this project comes to you is one where we've had a long effort with historic resources dating back to 1968 in the city, and that most of our energies have been devoted to telling a very narrow version of the city's history. And so one piece that I'm excited about being here today, I'm excited about where this conversation goes, is thinking more holistically about what historic resources are, how are they protected, whose histories are or are not told, and how in the future I and we can do better to make sure that historic resources are inclusive, not just of all histories of the city, but looking forward, how can we better use, maintain, and adapt historic resources for changing needs of the community. So I think we have a lot of work to do. I'm really excited to be here. I'm excited to be before this commission. I know we're going to go on a bit of a journey. And so Sandra and I thought the best way to start things out today would be to talk, the big picture, the 30,000 foot view, and then narrow it down to the code amendments that we're going to be asking you to take a look at. Back in 1968, the city of Portland established the second Historic Resources Program on the West Coast. That establishment of the program in 1968 came with two things. One, the recognition of a Historic Landmarks Commission, and two, the sort of the seeds of historic landmark and district designations that we know today. Those earliest efforts in the 1960s were primarily in the central city, and even more narrowly in the Skidmore Old Town area around the Skidmore Fountain. Just so you get a sense of who is at the table internally at the city working on historic resources issues, Bureau of Planning and Sustainability manages the long-term and policy framework for historic preservation in the city. You all have touched on different historic preservation issues in your 10 years on the PSC, whether that was in Better Housing by Design project, whether that was in the residential infill project, or Central City, where we maybe touch on management of specific historic resources or alignment of our zoning map and zoning code with specific historic places. But as Sandra mentioned, it's been about 7 years since staff have been before you with a historic resource specific package of code amendments. Our partners over at the Bureau of Development Services, who have helped us develop these code amendments, they perform quasi-judicial reviews related to historic resource demolition, alteration, addition, and new construction. And the Bureau of Development Services also staffs the Historic Landmarks Commission, which, as I mentioned a minute ago, was established back in 1968, and both provides guidance and expertise to the city on historic resource items and performs quasi-judicial reviews of large applications. In the legislative arena, the Historic Landmarks Commission in the past has been responsible for recommending historic district design guidelines to the City Council for adoption. So similar in role to the Design Commission, and many of you who work closely on the Design Overlay Zone Amendments project will see some parity between the tools, the procedures, and the nuance of the code that we'll talk about today, from the design overlay to the Historic Resource Protection Program. Narrowing us down a little bit, to the state context. Some of you are probably familiar with Land Use Goal 5. Some of you are probably expert in Land Use Goal 5. Land use goal 5 applies to scenic, natural, open space, and historic resources. So we have a land use goal that gives the city direction on how to maintain a historic resources program. We also have something unique in the nation in Oregon, in that we have a statutory framework for how cities in the state of Oregon can and must manage the designation of historic resources. So that state law, ORS 197772, does two things. One, unlike any other state in the country, and unlike any other arena of legislative land use decision making, in Oregon, owner consent is required for historic landmark designation, and owner consent, a majority owner consent, is required for the designation of historic districts. And so we have a state framework that says that the owner plays a somewhat elevated role in land use decision making around historic resource designation. That part of the law only applies at the time of designation. So it's really thinking about when something is decreed as a landmark or when an area is established as a district. And the flip side of that law, which again is unique in the nation, the flip side of the law is that federal listing in the National Register of Historic Places, which is generally an honorific National Park Service program intended to create eligibility for financial incentives, grant programs, recognition of historic places. That state law requires cities and counties in Oregon to apply a land use protection program to resources listed in the National Register of Historic Places. The context of Land Use Goal 5 and the state law was largely unchanged since the mid-1990s. But myself and our colleagues at the Office of Government Relations in 2017 participated in a state administrative rulemaking effort where both the land use goal and the statute were reviewed, and new administrative rules were adopted by the Land Conservation and Development Commission, giving us both a mandate and an opportunity to take a big picture look at how we manage historic resources here locally. Down at the nitty-gritty of the city level, in 1968, we first created the historic level of designation, so it's historic landmarks and districts. And then about a decade later, in response to primarily the Lair Hill neighborhood and the South Auditorium Urban Renewal Project, City Council adopted a conservation level of designation, which, to quote, the creation of the conservation level of designation was a significant area that was protected at less than historic district status. And so the idea with the conservation designation was that it'd be somewhat of a silver standard of protection, areas that had historic significance, but that may not be appropriate for the gold level protections that come with historic status. In the early 1980s, the Historic Landmarks Commission, city planners, architects, historians, PSU students surveyed historic resources citywide as part of an effort called the Historic Resources Inventory. That effort looked at about 5,000 places citywide that had a variety of architectural, cultural, social histories, and evaluated those places for their potential eligibility for historic or conservation designation. Many of those resources that were documented have since been designated as landmarks or included in historic and conservation districts, but many are also just still on our map of potentially significant historic places. In all due respect to that 1984 effort, there were a variety of social, cultural, community histories that were told in the inventory, but at the same time, the effort largely favored inner neighborhoods and largely favored the types of historic resources that, especially in the 1980s, were seen as most significant to the city's history. And then since 1996, here in Portland and statewide, National Register listing has meant automatic application of land use regulations. And the way our code dealt with that for efficiency and just because the thinking at the time was that National Register listing automatically conveyed local historic status. So places like the Irvington Historic District or the Paul Bunyan statue, upon their listing in the National Register, have automatically been identified as historic landmarks and historic districts. It's a unique nuance in our code that I don't think any other large city in the country has. And so we've got to wrestle with this in a unique way here in Portland. And we'll talk more in a minute about what our counterpart cities do. But the code today has National Register listing automatically convey local historic status. And here's a good sort of the big picture of what's out there. What are we talking about? It's about 2,400 acres of the city that fall into the historic resource status today. There are 735 individually listed historic landmarks. Some of those historic landmarks also happen to be in districts. So there's some overlap that exists, but historic landmarks are places like the Baghdad Theater, the Broadway Bridge, the St. John Signal gas station, Pittock Mansion, the Old County Courthouse. Historic landmarks are individual buildings that have been listed in the National Register or identified by the city through a designation process as having the highest level of historic significance and protection. There are 12 buildings, which aren't a lot citywide, that are identified as conservation landmarks, so subject to a lesser level of protection, maybe less important to the community as a whole. There are 20 historic districts. These are places like Ladd's Addition, Irvington, the Skidmore Old Town District, the Alphabet District, but there are also places like the Piedmont Conservation District, the Rocky Butte Scenic Drive, and Willamette National Cemetery. So not all of our districts are the same, and not all of them tell the same types of histories. And then there are just under 1,000 buildings that were identified in that 1984 effort to document historic buildings that were determined to be significant, potentially eligible for designation, but they haven't been designated as a landmark or part of a district. And I should mention, we talk about districts, so we're going to talk about a lot in a little bit. Districts at the historic or conservation level contain both contributing or historic buildings and non-contributing or non-historic buildings. And so if you look at a place like Ladd's Addition, some of the buildings, some of the properties were built during a historic period that was documented in the creation of that district. Other buildings were built more recently or were altered to the point where they didn't really tell that district story. In a district context, it's everything that's in the boundary is considered to be part of the district, but we apply regulations differently based upon whether it's contributing or not contributing. And much like the design overlay zone, all of these historic resource types are identified, described, and regulated through the historic resource overlay zone. So there's going to be some parity here between historic resources and what you talked about with those. I'm going to turn it over to Sandra here in a second. But one thing we wanted to talk about, because about 4/5 of our historic resource land area is in districts. So we're thinking landmarks and districts as the two categories of historic resource types. We did want to give you a good sense of where those districts were, demographic profiles. But before Sandra takes over, I did want to say that what we've tried to do here is to get the commission and get those listening thinking about the different types of historic resources, the different levels. And so on this map, you'll see in yellow or gold, those areas that are identified as historic districts. In silver, which look like kind of white on this map, those are the conservation districts. And then the areas that are outlined in bronze are areas that have been listed in the National Register that our zoning code would currently identify as historic districts, but that state law tells us we have to treat differently. We're proposing to pull those places out and call them National Register districts. I'll explain that more in the proposals. But as you track along, think about the outlines corresponding with different levels of protection, gold, silver, and bronze. And note that not all districts are collections of buildings. Some, like Rocky Butte Scenic Drive or the Washington Zoo, the Zoo and Washington Park Railway, are districts that are not so much about buildings, but about landscapes. So Sandra, I think I'll turn it over to you to talk us through some profiles of where our districts are located and what we know about them.
Great, thank you, Brandon. So the next series of slides is basically a series of maps that we wanted to share with you based on where the districts are. And as Brandon described, there's landmarks and there's districts. And when we say districts, we mean both conservation and landmark historic districts. So the next series of slides just gives you a flavor of the demographic makeup of the districts, not specific about anyone in particular. I want to emphasize, though, that the project amendments that we're talking about aren't changing district boundaries. It's just we're sharing this as a helpful picture for you to keep in the back of your mind as we're talking about these properties. So this slide, slide number 8, shows the percentage of Black, Indigenous, and people of color living in census tracts. The darker the purple, the higher the percentage. As reference, about Portland citywide now is about 30% BIPOC communities. So that those two purple colors, the two highest percentage are more diverse as far as more people of color, and then the blues have less than the citywide average. It also shows with the historic districts placed on top of it that the most racially diverse districts are actually the conservation districts in North and Northeast Portland and those in and around Central City. Next slide, please. This next slide is about the median family income. This is again by census tract. The darker the color, the higher the income. The districts in near the Central City are likely more economic diverse than what can be gleaned from the median. But you can see that there is, some districts that are definitely the dark green and some that are a little lighter green. Next slide, please. This next one is about the median home value of owner-occupied units. We wanted to just point out that this only captures owner-occupied units. It doesn't capture multi-dwelling properties that have big apartment buildings on them because we didn't want that to skew the numbers. But basically, it shows the home values track with what's generally true for inner Portland. The darker the color, the higher the income, and that's concentrated on mostly the west side and inner pattern area as opposed to the east side. Next slide, please. This slide shows that we have a lot of zones, first of all, because there's so many colors on this slide. But basically, there's two pies. The left pie is landmarks area by zone. So it's not number of properties, it's the number of acres. So it's 420 acres of the city that are designated with a historic landmark. And on the right pie is the district area by zone, about 1,900. For comparison purposes, I think for the design overlay, we had 4,500 acres of the city. So this is about half of that. And I just want to offer 3 observations since we just got these pies and we were thinking of it in these terms. One thing that I observed was, and I was really surprised at how much green area there is in the pies. I didn't realize that so many landmarks were on open space zone, so 20% there, and in the districts, about 29% of the districts are open space zone. That's one observation. Another observation is that many individual landmarks appear to be, they must be in Central City because the bright red and the purple on the left pie is considerable, about almost a quarter of the landmark area. And so those are CX and EX zones, which you're finding in Central City. Well, that makes sense, right? The older parts of the city. Another observation is on the right in the district area pie, half of the area is in the single family zones, as opposed to a third for the landmarks. And so, of course, when we're talking about single family zones, next slide, please, Brandon. Thanks. We're reminded of the history of the historical context of racist planning document that the BPS published last year. So we wanted to share a few slides along those lines about the intersectionality of that work and this work. So this map, you may recall, is the 1924 zoning map that accompanied Portland's first zoning code. In that era, there were 2 residential zones. One was called Zone 1 for single dwelling and Zone 2 for multi-dwelling. This map just shows the single dwelling areas in yellow, and these were considered the 15 quote highest quality neighborhoods that were zoned single dwelling, and they were created at the request of property owners. In that report, you might remember, next slide, please, 13, thank you. You might remember that we took a look at the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which assessed the neighborhood's desirability by assigning colors on the map. Green were the best or at least risky, blue were still desirable, yellow definitely declining, and red was hazardous. This is what's called the redlining map. And some areas of the city, even if the housing was in good shape, it was considered redline because the percentage of people of color was high. So this map shows Portland's redline map with original single family zone boundaries that all are green and blue on this map. And as you may recall, that report, one of the conclusions of that report is that the zoning that was put in place in the 1920s has continued a pattern of exclusion that lives on today. Those areas tend to be less racially and economically diverse than the city average. Home values are still very high, and there's low levels of people who are in jeopardy of displacement, or vulnerable populations, as we've been calling them. So we were wondering, so in the context of this, is it the same for the historic resources, historic districts? Is that true? Next slide, please. So we took the same map and we pulled off those original areas and we put the historic districts on them. And I think the answer is mixed, unless you're seeing something I'm not seeing. If you count the historic districts, you'll find that one is entirely green, and that's the proposed historic district of Eastmoreland. It's not entirely green, it's green and blue. 4 historic districts, actually I shouldn't say historic districts, because they could either be conservation or historic districts. 4 of them are blue, 4 of them are yellow, 3 of them are red, and those are along MLK and the interstate. And the rest aren't rated. So I think it would be a stretch to draw any causality from these maps, but we wanted to share with you what we had observed and some resources that you might be drawing upon as we embark on our next meetings. Again, we're just sharing these maps for informational purposes. They aren't central to the proposals that Brandon's going to be walking you through, but they are some interesting background. Now, that's it for the maps.
Sandra, can I break the rule for a second? And just in your map grades there, is this showing that Ladd's Addition is definitely declining? Or am I misreading this?
No, that's what it's showing. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, Ladd's Addition, a historic district. It's all yellow. Right, Brandon? That's what we're seeing, right?
That's what we're seeing. And if they're
meaning define declining, meaning like,
meaning that, well, remember the red are the areas where it was considered hazardous and they got a lower rating, which means the interest rates were a lot higher, and that generally Black people could only get loans in the red areas. They were not given loans in the other areas. So that's where the term redlining comes from. What we never talk about is greenlining. So I think the blue and the green areas were greenlined, and they received lower interest rates and exclusion of BIPOC community from those areas. So yeah, Ladd's Addition was, in the middle, but on the lower end.
And I did think it was important for commissioners to see at the bottom center the proposed Eastmoreland Historic District. That's a proposal for National Register listing. It's in progress. At this point, the city has no authority to, and has not had authority to stop that listing or to make that listing happen. But as this project moves through PSC and on the city council, at some point during the next 6 to 8 months, it's not unreasonable to think that the National Park Service will make a decision on that district. And so I'm putting it here so that everyone has a good sense of what that proposal is as well.
So that was it for me, Brandon. You want to talk a little bit about your program in general? Like, even if you're not working on this historic resources project, you still have a lot on your plate for the next couple of slides that you wanted to share, right?
Yeah, thanks, Sandra. I think this is where
Brandon, do you mind if I quickly interject? Because I had one question on this slide, a couple slides back. Is that okay?
If it's okay, Kat, yeah, let's do it. We'll go back, and then I will stop with next 2 slides, and we'll go into Q&A. But if you want to clarify, we'll go back.
It's the pie chart, and it's really just, I did not see the R20 listed in the district area. Is that because it's so small, or is that just an oversight? That's all.
I don't know that there is any R20 in districts. We had our GIS team run these straight from the zoning map. So,
got it. Okay.
Probably no R20 districts.
Thank you.
So Mike, do you have it really quickie, or do you want to wait? I'm just noticing.
It started a bad thing. Sorry.
I started a bad thing.
I can wait.
Great. Okay. And we'll just do 2 more slides. Since we're here, though, I will say that the R20 for landmarks, it's just a small handful of individual landmarks. So numerically, there aren't that many landmarks in R20, but because they're in R20, they're all pretty big. So that skews that data on R20 because we're looking at area, not numbers. So I did want to give a little flavor to today and over our next 4 or 5 or however many meetings we go before we are comfortable with the recommendation of City Council. I did want to give a flavor of what else that the Bureau is working on. For the last 20 some years, the Bureau has been a certified local government, which is a National Park Service credential that gives the city the ability to engage with federal and state funded projects. It does come with an expectation that the city have a Historic Landmarks Commission and develop local programs to protect historic resources. That certified local government status also makes us eligible for small biannual funding for targeted consultant projects. So there's a little bit of money that comes with it. But in general, the National Park Service says cities have broad latitude to decide how best to protect their historic resources and how best to define their local programs. And so even though the National Park Service provides us guidance, they give us best practice advice, they invite us to the table about federal decision-making, we do have broad local latitude. I and some of my colleagues coordinate with regional, state, and federal agencies on historic preservation matters. And one that we'll talk about a little bit later, but I just wanted to make everyone aware of, was that in 2019, myself and the Office of Government Relations did work with a legislative work group on a proposed Senate bill that would have decoupled the automatic protection of National Register resources. We were unsuccessful in 2019 in that effort. Part of why this project has taken so long to get to the PSC was because we were looking for one more piece of the puzzle at the state level to change, and that didn't happen, but we do coordinate with our other government partners. We have multiple bureaus in the city that manage historic resources, Water Bureau, Parks Bureau, OMF. And so one of our roles is to be the internal expertise on historic resources around federal funding, required compliance with state and federal laws that don't apply to most property, but do apply to government property. We're on track to continue to update and develop district design guidelines for historic districts. Some of you may remember a few years ago, I came and briefed the commission on proposed design guidelines for the new Chinatown, Japantown Historic District. Those were adopted by City Council a few years ago. Part of our Southwest Corridor planning work, we are updating the design guidelines that apply in the small South Portland Historic District to ensure those guidelines allow for development in that neighborhood aligned with the zoning that exists there. We update the zoning map, the historic resource information, sort of all the information available to architects, designers, real estate agents, property owners. And I haven't talked about this with the PSC, but we talked about it at length with the Historic Landmarks Commission and City Council. We recently worked with the Oregon Black Pioneers and a variety of archivists and individuals in North and Northeast Portland, which was more of a 4.5-year effort to document African-American historic sites and to elevate the documentation and the significance of those properties to the National Register, to create a framework for future efforts to advance how people plan policies and to serve as a model for other thematic groups of resources, whereby we look at historic resources through an equity lens where we're not comparing all histories with white dominant history, but that we can compare histories within their communities so that we can suss out which properties are the most significant without having the sort of citywide comparison. And for a long time, we haven't seen African-American historic sites documented or designated in the city of Portland because the National Park Service has required their comparison with white dominant histories. It's a tough and impossible charge to say that African-American church should be compared with all the white churches around it for a variety of reasons. So this project has changed the dynamic around how we think about African-American historic sites in terms of significance, but also given us a model that we might apply elsewhere. And at the end of volume 1 of the staff report, we give a flavor of what type of future work may be out there after my and our colleagues' time is sort of freed up from zoning code amendments, but thinking about continuing to advance the people plan policies that directly relate to historic resources. There are several people plan policies that speak to how to designate, honor, and make economically viable sites that are significant to Black history in the city. Thinking about updating the historic resources inventory holistically and incrementally to ensure that all histories are represented in that inventory and that those histories that have been overrepresented or no longer appropriate for protection are reevaluated. We're looking at opportunities for rehabilitation and adaptive reuse that might happen at the local, regional, or federal level and part of our coordination effort. And then thinking big picture, some of our counterpart cities, San Francisco, San Antonio, Seattle, Vancouver, BC, have started to come up with some really creative ways to protect legacy businesses and to fund cultural resource strategies. And I think we're not super behind the curve, but I think that our counterpart cities are really showing us that there are options and creative ideas for us to get outside of our zoning regulations and think about cultural preservation in ways that may have nothing to do with buildings and everything to do with people and institutions. So direction I would love to see us go, and I think it's a future work question, is how do we get more creative in preserving history outside of the zoning code? But today we're going to talk about the zoning code regulations. We're going to talk about the bureaucratic mechanics of how our program works, how we can make it work better. And before I get into the proposals, we're going to spend a few minutes with Q&A. And since Chair Spivak and Commissioner Schultz already jumped the line a little bit here, we might only spend 6 or 8 minutes, then we'll move on to the staff proposals. But we'll stop there, talk about the program area, and then we'll dig into the HRCP proposals.
Thank you. We'll go to Mike, and then after Mike, Oriana.
Yeah, you mentioned during the presentation landscape and looking at the maps, things like Terwilliger, Ross Island. There are a number of landscapes that I think really fit into the city's history. I'm curious whether any future work might be looking at some of those landscapes.
Yeah, it's a good question, Commissioner Houck. I should say that there is now a proposal to designate Terwilliger Parkway on the National Register of Historic Places. I've been in communications with our colleagues over at Parks Bureau. To date, Parks Bureau is sort of evaluating the regulatory effect of that, and it looks like that may be a good example of a designation. It doesn't necessarily have a regulatory consequence, given what the National Register means for protection. But for a long time, there's been some really good evidence and documentation about where historic designations might overlay with cultural landscapes. And I think as we get into the proposals, maybe asking you and fellow commissioners to think about what a reimagined set of protections would look like for historic resources and how that might or might not dovetail with cultural landscapes. But we do have places like the Halpern Open Space Sequence that is a historic district, and a variety of park spaces citywide that are either landmarks, part of districts, or identified as part of that historic resource inventory and have not been designated and protected.
Yeah, part of my thinking is going back to the 1903 Olmsted Plan and looking at some of the landscapes that were recommended to be part of the city's park program, some of which actually are now, but some of which haven't been. So anyway, I think that historic document might be an interesting place to start from a landscape perspective.
And I think one last thing I'll say in response to that is I think we've traditionally collectively thought of historic places as just buildings. But what you'll see in these proposals and what we've gleaned from other cities is that parts of buildings or smaller objects may be really exciting and new opportunities for designation. And I'm thinking about East Portland, which has been almost exclusively excluded from our historic resource designation programs, and the types of places there that would be most important for discussions around designation. They may or may not be full buildings. I'm sure there'll be some, but we might be talking about murals, we might be talking about structures, we might be talking about small open spaces and the like.
I'm going to move us along if that's all right. So let's go to Oriana and then Chris, and then if there's a minute, I'll got a question too, or else I'll wait. Oriana.
So I've got a few questions, but I'll ask one now and then put my hand up and hope we have a little bit more time. I think the first question is, what kind of value does historic district or historic landmark status add to a property in terms of the tax credits that are possible, or just in terms of how does it affect a home value? And then I think I would compare not just the historic districts piece, but the conservation district piece in particular, because of that demographic difference between people living in historic districts versus people living in conservation districts.
Yeah, great question. And I'm going to interpret the word value here to be monetary value. Like I'm going to think of it as a financial dollar value.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying that.
So a couple things. One, designation in and of itself doesn't bring any automatic change in assessed value or any automatic application of public subsidy to a property. So there's no immediate financial effect of designation. That said, there's federal, state, and local financial benefits. Starting at the federal level, for commercial properties that are listed in the National Register, so not locally designated, but listed in the National Register, income producing properties are eligible for a federal rehabilitation tax credit. And so in the central city primarily, but also on some of the corridor streets, we've seen bigger building rehabilitation projects, seismic upgrades, system upgrades of properties that are listed in the National Register take advantage of that federal 20% rehabilitation tax credit. And that tax credit is not available to owner-occupied housing. So primarily has been a tool useful for bigger adaptive reuse projects that are income producing. And there's been some creative uses of it, like the White Stag Block, where University of Oregon partnered with a private development entity to access those tax credits for that kind of project. At the state level, since 1975, there's been a property tax incentive program for all properties listed in the National Register, so commercial and owner-occupied single family. That program, when it first started, was intended to be a way for the state to encourage downtown rehabilitation. The proliferation of National Register districts and National Register listing really expanded the pool of properties eligible for that program. And the way it works is a property owner who has a National Register listed building can enroll in the Special Assessment of Historic Property Program and receive a 10-year freeze on the assessed value of their property, allowing for a property owner to do major rehabilitation work and ward off for 10 years the financial impact of that rehabilitation. I did my master's thesis on this topic. It's a program that has needed overhaul for quite some time. And it is set to expire in July of 2021. So there's likely going to be a legislative conversation this year, but I will say it has been a tool that has been used by many single-family owner-occupied properties. And then at the local level, there are grants and other private foundation dollars. The city does not offer any cash incentives or bonuses. We do, in some zones, allow transfer of development rights, which can be a financial benefit, and I'll talk about that in the proposals.
Thank you. We've got an expert here. Chris.
And thank you. So Andrea shared at the beginning of the meeting that residential infill is apparently not going to be appealed, which is great news. I was reading some of the testimony that's beginning to accumulate about this project and saw in there concern that some of these district tools could be weaponized to prevent RIP-style development. Can you comment on whether that's possible, or if we've put in considerations to prevent the tools from being used in that way?
Yeah, good question, Commissioner Smith. And I will say this has been an area my thinking has evolved, and some of the commissioners have been influential in that evolution of thinking. Because Oregon automatically applies land use regulations to National Register listing, we have seen areas of the city without a vote of the city council or involvement from this commission or the broad public seek and receive National Register designation to create a historic district. And as we've seen that proliferate on the east side with large districts like Irvington, Laurelhurst, and the proposal for Eastmoreland, that has increasingly caused me concern about our relationship with the National Register. And in 2017, one of the primary objectives in that state rulemaking effort was to create a statewide baseline for what National Register meant. And for us, that meant that we changed National Register listing from bringing with it the full suite of gold level protections to just bringing demolition review, which is still a land use effect. But the barter deal out of that process was that statewide National Register listing would only mean demolition review going forward, and no longer bring in the city of Portland all the design protections that used to come with it. I will say that in 2019, we did have an interest, and the Office of Government Relations was involved in further decoupling that National Register listing so that district designation decisions could ask that very question that you're asking, Commissioner Smith. We're not all the way there, but I'm hoping this project can help us have the right reconciliation process whenever a district is considered for listing.
So National Register recognition could not, for example, block ADU creation. Is that right?
Right. And the way that our colleagues and the City Council and you all looked at the residential infill project was generally agnostic to the presence of a historic district, with the exception of a little wrinkle around demolition review and a property couldn't take advantage of middle housing if it was demolished without demolition review and it was in one of our historic or conservation districts. But the allowance, the unit allowance, would apply in historic and conservation districts and for historic and conservation landmarks. So they're not exempt from RIP levels of density. I think we can go further, and it's part of the code proposals, and we'll talk about that in a minute.
Okay, thanks.
I have a quick question, and then I'm going to go to Oriana for a follow-up. Can you give us an idea on staff time, how your staff time is distributed? I'm thinking in terms of, especially with some of these affluent, large geographic areas, I imagine that you're answering questions, people are doing discretionary reviews. It takes a certain amount of money to maintain the historic review apparatus, and you're part of that. And I'm just curious whether you think that's equitably distributed right now. Any comments on that?
Yeah, good question. I started in my role about 5 years ago, and previous to me being there, the role was vacant for a few years. And my partner just accepted a job in COVID work, and they described their COVID work as building the plane while it's flying. And I feel like the last 5 years has been a bit building the plane while it's flying. Because what we see anytime there's a proposal to create a historic district like Laurelhurst or Eastmoreland, the necessity for city staff to be involved to provide good public information for a process that's outside of our normal land use venue is a big drain, and it's a blind side for staff when one of these proposals come up. So I will say that Eastmoreland, and to a lesser extent, was a significant chunk of staff time to make sure there was good public information for part of a federal process that the city had no involvement, but the land use effects really warranted my time responding questions.
Okay, I'm going to go.
Commissioner Spivak, you're muted.
A quick question from Oriana and Jeff. So Oriana?
I'll let Jeff go ahead of me since he hasn't asked a question yet.
Okay, Jeff.
Thank you. I just want to kind of emphasize or clarify a point you were making about historic districts. Under the current legal structure, state and federal, if something is a historically designated district, I'm just thinking of districts right now, Portland has to have some form of demolition, but other than that, Portland would be free to regulate federal districts however it wanted to. So that's my first question, if you would confirm that. And then two, would that mean Portland could eliminate all design review requirements for for any housing in a historic district? I'm thinking in particular now of Irvington, proposal for Eastmoreland, Laurelhurst, where you hear lots of complaints from homeowners in those districts who want to replace windows or do some kind of modification to their houses and get stuck in a horrendous, expensive historic design review. Often they give up, particularly if they can't hire, experts to help them through the process. So, to repeat, one, is that correct? Demolition is the only type of regulation Portland's required to have. And two, would that mean we could get rid of most, if not all, design type requirements in historic districts?
I think I'll answer it in two parts. One, not all historic districts were created equal, right? So before 1995, many historic districts were created by recommendation of this commission and by the Landmarks Commission and have significant city investment in the adoption of design guidelines and refinement of zoning. I'm thinking about places in the central city or close to the central city. Some of those historic districts are on the National Register. The conservation districts are not. But now, as of 2017, state admin rule says the city can only and must protect new National Register listings with just demolition review. And previous National Register listings only need demolition review as its land use protection, which is a long way of saying if the city council decided that all historic districts on the National Register should only have demolition review, the state admin rule would suggest that that would be compliant with Goal 5.
Thank you.
Okay. Oriana?
So this builds a little bit off of Eli's question with regard to demographics and historic districts or conservation districts. If we make the process of creating historic districts or historic landmarks more equitable in terms of, in particular, focusing on landmarks that are important to Black communities in gentrified neighborhoods or neighborhoods full of displacement like Albina, which is a conservation district, Is it too late is my question, because we've already seen a lot of development in the Mississippi and Albina areas in North and Northeast Portland in ways that have done significant harm to communities while also creating more housing and allowing more people to move into communities. How do we assess that difference between what should have maybe been done 10, 20 years ago versus what we can do now? And is there a way to maybe build a reparative element around community stability or home ownership for historic districts or conservation districts that really draws from that green lining, red lining map that we looked at, which, by the way, thank you for including that.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think this is where the public testimony and all of you will really help inform the discussion. Again, part of it is I'm bringing the most bureaucratic technical Title 33 recommendations forward, but there's a lot outside of Title 33 that would get at cultural stability and cultural preservation. I think two things. One, when those conservation districts in Albina were created in 1993, the idea was that they would be areas of relative stability in Albina, areas that would see less change. But as the city since 1993 has increased the regulatory protections on historic districts, we haven't done the same for conservation districts. And so what we've ended up with is conservation districts that have a protection program today that haven't really made them areas of relative stability as far as zoning regulations are concerned. And I think that when we think about just gentrification and displacement, I think we want to think about two things that are going on. Like, one, what's happening today and in the future, but two, also how historic preservation can serve as a tool to protect us from erasure. And I think about Lower Albina, and I think about the African-American community that existed around the Golden West Hotel on the west side, and those areas where the resources are gone and there's no ability to connect with a building or place that is a permanent monument to that history. I guess I want to say, looking backwards at history, even in areas where gentrification and displacement has meant that the previous community is gone, there may still be a value to the city of ensuring that there are landmarks to that history that stay standing. And then the second piece, and this is where I'm maybe excited where the commission goes in your discussion, there may be things outside of Title 33 we need to do to make sure it all works and works well.
Thank you. Well, let's let you continue with your presentation.
Okay, now we're going to get into how do I want to say the complicated nuance of how all this state and local context fits within the zoning code proposals. I think unlike other areas of the zoning code, historic resources mean a lot of things to a lot of people, and historic resources have meant that a lot of people have been excluded from the benefits that come from historic preservation, whether those are financial benefits, community benefits, benefits of memory. And so one of the things that I wanted to do as the project manager and in concert with our partners on the Bureau of Development Services side and staff in BPS was think about what are some value statements that we hope that these code proposals can help advance. They may not be the one and only tool to achieve the outcomes that we're imagining here, but we are thinking about the necessity to amend the code to make historic preservation work better and work better for more people. One of those things is about the meaningful and tangible connection to the past. We have historic resources citywide that maybe aren't in the same use or maybe aren't in an area that demographically looks like it did 100 years ago, but they do provide a meaningful and tangible connection to the past. I'm thinking about places like the New Chinatown Japantown Historic District, the Rutherford House, the Canzano Family House, places that even if they have changed in their use, still connect us to a past that looked different than today. Part of a value for historic resources is that if we are committing to protecting buildings or places for the long term, how can we extend and expand their useful life through adaptive reuse, through reducing landfill waste? Thinking about historic resources as opportunities and the places where we might be able to acknowledge and reverse past harms. Thinking about some of our historic districts that tell a story. It's a story that's grounded in racism and it's grounded in exclusion, but are there levers that we can pull that allow those historic resources to evolve in a way that departs from their racist pasts? Thinking about the broad community needing to be involved in designation decisions. And for me, this is where the National Register has really fallen short in its ability to ensure that the full community values and recognizes the importance of places when the National Register designation process is really just about those affected owners. So thinking about how can we engage the broad community and how do we prioritize histories that aren't already included in the inventory for documentation designation. And then last but not least, how can we think about historic places as areas that can evolve and that can continue to contort to meet the needs of Portlanders in the future? And that we think about that history that Sandra just shared, we think about the histories of individual buildings and think creatively about how can historic places, if they're to be preserved, best meet the needs of the city. And that might look like a variety of different things. A couple of specific equity-focused goals for the project. One, thinking about the clarity and accessibility of code language at a high level with all of our zoning code projects. How can we make sure the code is easy to interpret, easy to apply, specific to historic resources? How can we expand the list of work that never has to come before city staff or the Historic Landmarks Commission or meet standards? Thinking about minor changes that typical property owners and tenants would need to make to properties. Is there a way for us to expand that list of work that does not need to meet review criteria or standards to allow for people to live in properties, to have commercial businesses, to evolve in place? Thinking about the criteria and the processes that we use to add things to the historic resource inventory or to remove things from the inventory. How can we make sure that all histories of the city are told in our historic resource inventory in a representative and appropriate way? And then last is how can we, if we are designating historic districts and protecting these places, how can we make sure that the broad public benefits from those decisions, has access to those places, and how can those places give back to the city and meet and exceed our comp plan policies for providing opportunity both for housing, economic uses. So really thinking creatively of adaptive reuse, about how healing can take place and how we really can use historic preservation for a community benefit beyond just those people who might live in a district. Just a quick background, and then we're going to just dive right into the proposals. I started this project about 3 years ago with a review of best practices nationally. What are other cities doing? What works? Where are their pitfalls? Where have they found successes? Primarily looking in their development regulations and the process by which they designate landmarks and districts. Some of that work has built a pretty good case for how we might explore outside of Title 33 legacy business and cultural district programs. But because we've got a Title 33 charge here, focusing in on how our place is designated, who makes decisions, and what are the right protections. We took that best practice research and that new state administrative rule mandate, and then in late 2017 and throughout the first half of 2018, held a variety of concept development workshops and focus groups citywide. We published our discussion draft in the winter of 2019. During that time, we were participating in the legislative work group to look at changes to state law. Even though those changes to state law didn't come to fruition in 2019, it gave us good insight and good, let's say, collaboration with a variety of interest groups about where we might go in the proposed draft. And it took us a little time, in part because staff are stretched working on a variety of issues and historic resource programs, and we released the proposed drafts on September 15th. We sent a Measure 56 notice to 16,077 property owners. Many of those owners are condo owners or historic resources that have multiple tax accounts. But we did send notice to all owners. We did not send notice to tenants or to other interest groups. We sent it just to the property owners. But over the last 6 weeks, I've now been part of about 15 virtual info sessions with a variety of groups, some of those being public info sessions, some of those being interest area specific sessions. And then outside of our sort of standard engagement process, I've been working closely with the African American Historic Sites Project and having sort of lengthy discussions about how the code can work better for those histories that haven't been told in our historic resource inventory. So that's a little flavor of where we've gone. We've heard from about 1,000 people so far in the process, and testimony starting to come into the map app, so we're going to hear from many more. I think I'll turn it over to Sandra here to give us an overview of the themes, and I'll dig in on the proposals.
That's great, Brandon. So we're really excited to share with you what the proposals are, and we're finally at the meat of today's conversation. As you can see, Brandon is a wealth of information and has been doing a great job with outreach and answering phone calls from all of those people who have received notices. A little bit in the nitty gritty, there are 2 volumes to the Historic Resources Code project. Volume 1 is not too long, about 44 pages. If you got paper copies of your volumes, this might be a good time to pull it up. Volume 1, take a look at page 7. Page 7 is kind of gives you what the 5 key themes are and lists all of the 14 proposals. That'll be our outline that we go through to discuss the proposals. Volume 2 is the usual code and commentary, code on the right side page and commentary on the left side page. And that's what you'll also be taking a look at. So to just delve into it, there are 5, we've organized all the substance around these 5 themes. The first one is identification, like what types of historic resources are there? The second is designation and how are they designated? What criteria and what process, who gets to designate them? How are those protected from demolition and from alterations in the future? The 4th theme is about reuse. How can historic resources be repurposed for economic viability and community access? And finally, an administrative piece is to improve the administration and enforcement of these rules. And back to the expert, Brandon.
Thanks, Sandra. There are 5 of these proposals that I expect to be the source of most of your testimony. Those are starred, and I'm going to make note of them as we get to it. And so just know that even though there's a pretty big pile of proposals, there are 5 that my goal is to make sure you walk away from today's meeting thinking we're going to hear a lot about these 5. Proposal 1A is not one of those, but just be prepared. There's been confusion for as long as I've been at the city and as long as I've been in the city working on historic resource issues about the ways in which historic resources are defined and described in the zoning code. And we think there's a better way to use federal best practice and advice from the state on how to describe and define the different historic resources that are regulated by the zoning code to give the public clarity and to better organize our protection program. Proposal 1A isn't a regulatory change, but it's a way for us to better identify the different types of historic resources so that we can put them in a hierarchy of protections. And to do that, we would take the notion of historic resource inventory and have that be our master list of historic places. Some of those regulated by the zoning code, some of them maybe just properties we have documentation on for public use and information. And for those that are regulated by the zoning code, really focusing in the rest of these proposals on those. This proposal in and of itself wouldn't be a regulatory change. It would just be changes to the titles and definitions that we use to describe some historic resources and what we mean by historic resource inventory to have it more closely match what the state is telling us the inventory should mean and should include. Proposals 1B and 1C are really looking at taking our list of historic resources, those resources that are identified by the zoning code, and clearly organizing them in a hierarchy of protection. And we're going to talk about protections in theme 3, but the thought is that because we have different types of historic resources today, and we have this new mandate from the state and new opportunity from the state, to have National Register listing means something different than it has since 1996, just demolition review protection, that we have sort of a once in a generation opportunity to restructure the hierarchy of historic resources, to think about a protection program that would apply a gold, silver, and bronze level of protection to historic resources at the historic conservation National Register level, and to give decision makers the ability to move things up or down a ladder logically based upon the appropriateness of regulation, based upon whether it's on the National Register, and based upon how significant a resource may be. This idea is one that first got started in 1977. We took a little bit of a departure for the last 20 years or 25 years by relying so heavily on the National Register. We now have an opportunity to bring back that local decision-making to an extent, now that National Register listing will only automatically convey some of the protections that apply to historic resources. We're going to talk more about protections in theme 3, but proposal 1B is organizing the hierarchy of resources. You'll see at the bottom of that ladder, significant resources. Significant resources are those that have not been designated, that have been identified through a legislative process as having historic significance, being eligible for designation. They're places that maybe aren't appropriate for protection, places whose owners have objected to designation, or places that haven't been considered yet for historic landmark status. About 900 of those that today we call ranked on the historic resource inventory. Proposal 1A would change it to being called significant. And those properties, because they're not designated, would be subject only to a small protection. I'll describe that in a minute. And they're subject to that protection today. And then proposal 1C would remove a category of resources from the zoning code that are called unranked resources. Those were documented in 1984. They weren't determined to have historic significance. The zoning code addresses those, but doesn't apply any regulations to them. We feel like that category of resources is better left out of the zoning code. There's no regulatory effect from doing that, but helps us organize the information, have our code be clear and consistent and understandable. So I don't expect a whole lot of feedback on the first theme of proposals. We'll surely get some, but to sort of get us at the big picture, theme 1 is about how do we identify, describe, and organize the different types of resources. To make theme 1 work and to make our historic resource program work about how we create landmarks and districts, theme 2 is all about designation. I expect proposal 2B will generate a lot of feedback. You're going to be hearing quite a bit about who makes decisions, how do they make decisions, and using what criteria are those decisions made regarding creating new landmarks and districts and amending or removing existing landmarks and districts. This is sort of a big move. This is consistent with what the city did before we started over-relying on the National Register as our default for protected historic status. So theme 2 you're going to hear a lot about on designation. Proposal 2A is really about thinking of how the city, through city staff, Historic Landmarks Commission, partnerships with community organizations, can update the base information that informs the historic resource inventory. How can we go out, document historic places, and work with communities to document historic places? So proposal 2A is establishing a procedure to identify new significant resources, and what do we use to determine that those would be eligible for a future designation. Proposal 2B is really where the rubber hits the road about who makes decisions around designation. Important to remember 2 things. 1, Oregon law does require owner consent to designate a landmark. It requires majority owner consent to create a district, and the city can't add or remove resources from the National Register. And so one of the reasons you see National Register called out as its own bronze level of protection on that hierarchy I showed a minute ago is that we really have no authority over the National Register program. We can advise the National Park Service. We can participate in the designation process. The National Park Service says we don't really care what City of Portland does about regulating those properties. We're making a decision about whether or not it meets our criteria. So we don't have control over whether or not something is listed or removed from the National Register. And I will say too, in the designation, for individual landmark properties, there has been an efficiency for a long time in the National Register automatically conveying local historic status. And so that's something we've thought about in the criteria and process for designation of city historic landmarks and conservation landmarks in these proposals. Designation is really another word for deciding that a historic resource is appropriate for protection. So designation is the vehicle by which a significant place gets protected. And so in the land use world, the whole point of designation, the whole discussion about designation is really the line over to protections. Today in the zoning code, we have 4 main ways we protect historic resources. One is demolition delay, which is an administrative delay period. Another is demolition review, which is a public hearing that weights discretionary approval criteria about whether the demolition is appropriate. And then on the design side, we have historic resource review, which is like design review. And we have clear and objective standards, the community design standards, which is a clear and objective path, an alternative to historic resource review. For those of you who work closely with the DOZA project, there's parity, or there's a line between historic resource review and design review, the design standards and the design standards that you reviewed in DOZA. So we're going to talk more about those in a few minutes. But the thinking on this project, sort of the big move, is to have a gold, silver, and bronze approach to how we identify landmarks and districts, and that we have a nesting approach to protections that apply at each level, that National Register listed resources get the baseline demolition review, conservation level resources get the demolition review plus the application of clear and objective design standards, sort of a 2-track approach like we do in the D overlay. And then our gold standard historic resources historic landmarks and historic districts have demolition review and required historic resource review for exterior alterations, additions, and new construction. I'm going to talk more about the changes in a minute that would make this work, but the big picture thinking is in organizing historic resources through a more clear hierarchy, allowing for decision-making for resources to go up and down that hierarchy in the future, and having a nested approach to protections, the code would be more straightforward, that we'd be able to make more intentional decisions about what menu is available to resource protection, and then also giving us the ability to more strategically reevaluate and evaluate potential future designations so that the level of protection best aligns with community benefit. To make that hierarchy of protections work, there are 4 protection proposals. You're going to hear a lot of feedback about most of those protection proposals. I suspect proposal 3A is something you'll hear quite a bit about. Today in those conservation districts, and as has been the case since 1977, conservation districts have been subject to demolition delay, but not demolition review. And there's a reason why some conservation districts have sought National Register status. Primarily, I'm thinking about South Portland, Ladd's Addition, and Irvington, all of which over the last 30 years have sought National Register status to gain demolition review as a protection program. The data show us, and what we've heard from public outreach over the last several years, is that the current conservation district protection program falls short and doesn't provide a meaningful way to conserve history because demolition delay is administrative, and there's no ability for the public to engage in conversations about demolition of resources. While the 2-track approach to design standards and guidelines has worked reasonably well at protecting historic features, has given owners more options and builders more certainty, the demolition delay regulation has been such that many of those areas are desiring National Register listing or historic district listing to allow for more engagement in proposed demolition. So proposal 3A would apply demolition review to landmarks and contributing resources in districts that are designated by the city, bringing up that minimum baseline that applies to National Register to all city designated resources, and to allow the conservation districts to be a next increment up on the protection scale from what's provided automatically to National Register listing. To do this and to do this intelligently, we're also proposing to expand the demolition review approval criteria so that resources on the National Register have the greatest number of options to get approval for demolition. Conservation level resources have a little bit fewer, and historic resources have the fewest options to get approved for demolition. The thinking being the lower you are on that protection chart, even if you're subject to demolition review, there should be more options to get the yes. Proposal 3B is another one you'll probably hear a lot about. In historic districts and conservation districts, where historic resource review and or the community design standards apply, today we have a list of work that's exempt from review. We call these exemptions. Very similar to what you talked about with DOZA. Proposal 3B would increase the list of exemptions for all historic resource types, increasing exemptions more for districts and more for the conservation level than for individual landmarks and specifically historic landmarks. But the thinking being that there's a variety of work items that ought to be exempt from review to allow for residential and commercial changes to buildings. We're thinking about things like small signs, mechanical, conduit, pipes. But 2 big proposed exemptions will likely get us quite a bit of feedback. One, we're proposing in districts to allow solar panels on side and rear facing roof slopes without review. So that's a big change from what's the case today, where solar panels do need to go forward for review and compatibility in districts. So that's a big change. Another big change would be to allow small 400 square foot detached accessory structures in the backyards of buildings to proceed without review. So the idea is to move the needle on allowing for backyard development at a small scale without going forward for review or meeting the community design standards. You're also likely to see a bit of feedback on proposal 3C, which would refine the approval criteria that apply in historic resource review. There's a few reasons why we're doing that. One, the new state administrative rules say we need to have criteria around building relocations. So we're proposing criteria around building relocation. And 2, we think that in some areas there's an ability to get a little more flexible with how we traditionally have defined compatibility and protection of historic resources for exterior alterations, additions, and new construction. This proposal wouldn't change any adopted design guidelines. So for those districts that have design guidelines, we're not proposing to change those guidelines, but we are proposing to change the criteria that apply to landmarks and districts without guidelines. And so I suspect proposal 3C, you will hear a bit, especially from the Irvington area, about what that proposal would mean for them. And then proposal 3D, we may get some feedback on, we'll see. Today, demolition delay is something that a property owner can apply for at any time and then supplementally come in for a demolition permit. What we've seen in recent years is a variety of cases where demolition delay and the permit issuance process aren't sequenced intelligently. And so there are some properties that go through demolition delay and months and years later apply for their demo permit. The community may be frustrated they didn't get that demolition delay period to meaningfully engage on the proposed demolition. So proposal 3D would align the sequencing of the demolition delay and the permit application issuance process so that delay happened only once and that it was defined and aligned with permit application. And under these proposals, demolition delay would only apply to those significant resources that haven't been designated. These proposals would apply that demolition review to all other historic resources addressed by the zoning code. On the reuse side of things, proposal 4A would exempt all landmarks in all districts at every level from parking requirements. So it'd be a change to the parking chapter of the code and eliminate any parking requirement that would exist for historic landmarks and historic districts. We may get feedback on that, but you and the city council have been pretty bold about parking in recent years. And so the impact of this proposal is less expansive than it would have been a year or two ago when we first started going down this road. Proposal 4B, though, is one you'll hear a lot about, and it may be the one you hear the most about, we will see. And proposal 4B is building off of some current flexibility in the zoning code that extends use incentives to historic resources. And historically, those use incentives have generally been for landmark properties. They've resulted in some internal conversion, sort of house to condo type projects. But in order for historic resources to be most economically viable, to allow for community access to resources, and to expect historic areas to give back to the city and meeting the needs of current and future Portlanders, proposal 4B really moves the needle on what types of uses would be allowed for historic landmarks and districts outside of what's provided by the base zone. In a single dwelling context, we would move towards a form-based approach to residential unit counts, so moving beyond RIP, and we'd be looking at allowing for accessory commercial uses in historic and conservation districts. So thinking a little outside the box and what the base zone allows, and for individual landmark buildings, thinking about places like the Kennedy School, Washington High School, maybe places like Liberty Bar, Beach Street Parlor, and both of those have closed recently, and how we can take old houses and do more with them to be creative. And then proposal 4C is a minor streamlining of how we allow FAR transfers to occur. And the last theme 5, we may hear a little bit about this one, but probably not a lot. And we're really refining the zoning code to make sure that all these proposals work. We're finding purpose statements, procedure types to align the procedures with the impact of proposals, informed by what you all did with DOZA. And then also making some slight adjustments to the role and makeup of the Historic Landmarks Commission, again, following in DOZA's footsteps. So a couple of proposals here, we'll see how much we hear about it, but I don't expect this is going to be the big area of public feedback. I'm going to turn it back to Sandra to close this out here, and then we will move on to some commissioner question and answer. And Sandra, you're muted.
Theme of the year. Thanks, Brandon. So that concludes what the proposals are. At the end of your deliberations, we're actually asking that the Planning Commission make a recommendation to City Council to adopt both volumes of this project, to amend the zoning code as shown in volume 2, and to adopt the ordinance, and as usual, to direct staff to refine the code language and commentary as necessary. And your next steps, next slide, please. So next steps, 2 weeks, you have a public hearing. We'll close that testimony on the Friday of the public hearing. So we have almost a month between closing of the testimony and your work session. We'll have some instructions for you during that time so we can start figuring out what potential amendments the commissioners have and what you want to discuss for the November 24th meeting. And we are aiming for a vote on December 8th. There's nothing magic about that date. It's just when we have you on the agenda, maybe we can make it, depending on your deliberations. And that's it.
Okay, great. Thank you. Well, while this has been going on, we've been madly trying to figure out how to handle question and answer. So we have about 10 minutes now, but I suspect we'll have more questions than that. So we're trying to figure out a way we can get some more Q&A time in with staff on this project. Maybe at our next meeting, we'll figure that out. But let's start off with some questions from the team, and we'll use our 10 minutes the best we can. And other ones you can send by email, or we'll have another opportunity at a future meeting. I've got some hands up, and I'm not sure how old they are. So I'll start with Mike Hauk, and then I've got Jeff, and then I've got Ben and Katie after them. So Mike.
Sorry, I thought I lowered it earlier.
Okay, Jeff.
Hang on, I just lost my Zoom connection. Can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Okay, I can't see anybody, but I guess that's good enough. Boy, I've got a ton of questions, so I will try to be very, very brief and then send an email. One, I appreciate all the incredible amount of work that's gone into this. And I would just say one thing about the code. I'm trying to work through the code. I'm finding a lot of just confusing, I'd have to call it muddle in it. I think the code needs some editing for two reasons. One, I'm not sure the code aligns up with the policy directions. I'll send an email and be specific. I'll give just one example as I've tried to work through the code very quickly. You've got a section 445.040 sub A that lists 5 factors for being a historic landmark, and it says you must meet one of them. Then you jump to 846.030 D 1 through 3, and it lists 16 factors, and it says you have to meet 6 of those factors. And they're inconsistent. They don't jibe. And so that's just one example I found where internally the code is not giving us clarity. And I'll send you some more examples of that, Brandon.
Jeff, that sounds great. I will say on that one, part of the bridge is what things were designated as landmarks in the past and for what reasons in the description and definitions, and then what things should be listed as landmarks in the future.
I think our time is better used if we just get our questions out there and then you can respond. But that's exactly what I'm talking about. Boy, there's a lot of nuance, and it's a very difficult code to manage, though I only have given it a few hours so far. One question I have is the process you said that for ranked resources today, there is one small regulatory requirement. I thought there were no regulatory requirements for ranked resources. And the second part of that question is, if we go to this process for designating significant resources, what is the regulatory significance of a being designated a significant resource? And my third question on this topic is, I think it's contrary to law, both state law, both ORS and both the administrative rules, to not give notice or not give property owners the right to object to being designated a significant resource. That's an important issue to me. I think if we're going to have a significant resource process, the state requirement that owners can object should apply to that. And then finally, I've got questions and policy concerns about what we're doing with districts. And again, this particularly applies to the residential districts. There are pretty limited exemptions for design/historic review in those districts. I think the exemptions need to be much broader. I think they're too onerous on homeowners. And more importantly, I think it's contrary as a matter of policy to what we've been doing with RIP and other things where we're trying to encourage more housing, more dense housing. And I think we have to be sure we're not working against those goals by having lots of design review requirements in areas like Irvington, Laurelhurst, Eastmoreland. That's it quickly.
I'm going to ask staff if we can follow up by email. We'll air the questions now, and if people have additional questions, that way we can at least get ideas out there. And people might do what I've done in the past with code projects, where I've got a bunch of questions and I'm not sure whether they're going to amendments or just, because I just write a little list down on a paper, send it to staff, and they can let me know what things might become an amendment, what are just clarifying something I don't understand in the project. So this might be a project where that will be helpful for people to just send in. So I'm going to go to, it was jumping around on my screen, Katie, and then Ben. Katie.
Sure. I was interested in earthquake safety, and does this project have anything to do with that? Where would there be a link with that? I mean, you know, that a lot of the historic buildings are a lot more vulnerable to earthquake damage, and that's kind of gone back and forth in terms of the city council and how much protections people get who live in historic buildings. So
Okay.
that can be answered later.
Great, thank you. Good one. Ben.
Yes, along similar lines, something that can be answered later. Spencer, you mentioned a couple of times elements that could be taken care of outside of Title 33. So I'm kind of interested to hear your ideas and what suggestions you may have. And again, you can follow up later.
Mike?
Yeah, I'll just comment. A friend of mine actually built an ADU in the Irvington area, and her house is non-contributing. And she really did run into a lot of issues with regard to requirements for color and a number of other things. You know, things like you have to frost your windows, and, you know, the neighbor who was opposed to the ADU complained that, you know, she might rent to smokers and all sorts of weird things. At any rate, that's just a case in point where somebody had to go through quite a lot to put in an ADU.
Thank you. Oriana.
So most of this will be follow up with Brandon, but I do want to put on the record at least where my head is at in this, which is I'm very interested in having that conversation around cultural designation and figuring out how we can use conservation or historic resources to preserve businesses that are essential to communities and a key element of community stability, and determining whether that's appropriate in this project or whether this is just an opportunity for us to daylight those issues more meaningfully. I think you'll also hear some follow-up from me in asking the question about how do we build reparative elements into this work. I think this is largely a very symbolic project in some ways, and important to preserve history, and important in particular to ensure that we're preserving Black and Indigenous history, as well as the history of other BIPOC communities in Portland. But I worry that simply extending historic designations or helping processes become more receptive to landmarks or districts east of 82nd, we're still not quite getting at the harm that has been done historically. And I wonder whether there are opportunities to address that through this project. I think I also would just want to name the concerns that I have for the coming testimony that we're not likely to hear from many BIPOC communities. I question whether those communities will find this project relevant or see it as an opportunity for engagement. And I'm worried that we're going to have much more testimony from folks who are angry about the changes and frankly may provide some racist testimony, whether it's intentional or not to that regard. So I just want to make sure that we're prepared as a commission to be thoughtful and maybe flag some of that as it comes up and be receptive in terms of how this project is intended to be framed, but also maybe where it falls short in actually making some meaningful change from a reparative perspective.
Thank you. Well, there is testimony coming in already on the MAP app, and one of them is, which I'll be interested to share from Sam Stuckey, is urging the members of the commission to remove any and all protections and privileges granted to historic districts that were shaped by discriminatory and racially exclusive planning methods, lending practices, and covenants. So we are hitting some of that testimony already, and I'm sure we'll have a variety more when it comes to us. The question I have is, which can be afterwards, is in the PALF plan, there were some specific recommendations, and I'm curious whether staff felt that any of those might be captured in this project as an amendment rather than waiting for some to be determined future project. And any other questions from PSC members? All right, well, it looks like we'll have some follow-up. Thank you very much for sharing. And with that, we're going to invite PSU commissioners to write anything else down, send it to staff. But right now, let's go to Director Durbin to introduce our next topic, which is on, I've got too many screens open here, on climate. And I'll hand the torch now before I mess up.
Thank you very much, Chair Spivak, and thank you to Brandon and Sandra for a great presentation. That was a good start to our further conversation around the Historic Resource Code. Now we're going to shift to a climate conversation, and this is really building on the conversation that we had with the commission during the summer. If you recall, we had a number, Michelle Krim and a number of other Bureau partners come and present on our climate adaptation work across the city and how we're addressing adaptation and resiliency issues. We reached out to PSU, Portland State University, a key partner of ours, and to really invite them to come and talk with us to really build on that conversation and talk more about how the commission can exercise your tools around land use transportation to further our climate goals and what some of those opportunities are, and really to share some more of the research and findings that PSU is doing. Of course, we've got some great colleagues and researchers at PSU who are doing groundbreaking work, and we really wanted to have an opportunity to bring them here, share some of that, and start this conversation. And this is really, we see as the first of what we hope will be many conversations that we can continue to build our understanding and looking kind of at the opportunities of how we further our climate goals through land use planning. So with that, I'm actually going to turn it to Fletcher Bowden, and just want to appreciate both Professor Shondas and Professor Loikith for joining us today to share more, and look forward to the conversation. So Fletcher, I'll turn it to you.
Great. Can everyone hear me? Yes. My old headset has been failing me recently, so if I tap out at some point, please raise your hand. I think I have sharing permissions, so I'm going to try and share. So I have the full presentation. I'll have a brief intro, and then Paul's going to go, and then Vivek will go, or Dr. Loikith and Dr. Shondas. And I'll kind of like tap through the slides for them. So Paul and Vivek, just let me know to advance. And I first want to just thank you all for having us here today. It's an honor to be able to engage with you folks who are working on kind of the future of our city, the present and the future. And I think we've got some interesting stuff to begin the conversation with, but I do also believe we're going to learn a lot from you all. One of the things that I think is very powerful about PSU's mission of connecting with the city is that we are not an ivory tower. We are literally in the city, and at least in my practice, I believe that we should be changed by the city just as much as we're working to influence it. So anyways, I thank you for the opportunity, and also, as Andrea had said, this is hopefully just the beginning. We are in the city. We care about this place. We're citizens of this place. And so this is not meant to be a flash in the pan, but the beginning of a conversation that will hopefully kind of frame future questions. So let me share my screen, or see if I can share screen. This one. Can everyone see that? Is that coming up for people?
Yes, it is.
Okay, great. So are you seeing my notes or the presentation?
Yeah, it's in presentation mode.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so as I said, my name is Fletcher Bedoin. I'm the director of the Institute for Sustainable Solutions. And I'm joined with Dr. Paul Loikith, who's associate professor in geography, and Vivek Shondas, who's professor in urban studies and planning. And so kind of the beginning of this presentation, I just want to reiterate this mission and this of PSU of let knowledge serve the city, and that we take that very seriously, our connection to the city and to this place, and to really making it the best place possible. And that we're growing our capacity in this topic of around climate adaptation and mitigation. There's a series of things, assets that we kind of built up at PSU. Just a few of the more recent ones. Paul is very involved with a recent, a new minor in climate adaptation. Oof, I'm going to get the name wrong. He'll have to pipe in, but I think it's climate adaptation and mitigation. Maybe Paul, you can correct me real quick.
Climate change, science, and adaptation, I believe.
Yeah. Unfortunately, if you go on the PSU's website right now, it's a holy mess. You can't find anything. So I was actually trying to find it earlier, and it's just a bunch of broken links. It's kind of embarrassing, actually. And Vivek is actually the head of the Super Lab, which is maybe the best acronym out there, which is the Sustaining Urban Places Research Lab. And we have a variety of students and faculty that have expressed deep interest in this topic. And then we also kind of have a long history of collaborative research, training, and engagement. We have numerous students that are now in places like BPS or different bureaus or working in community-based organizations. There's almost over 100,000 PSU alum in the city. And we also have this kind of deep connection to the climate work within the city. In about 2013, we'd started a series of very intentional projects with the city to really focus on how do we advance kind of the implementation of the 2015 Climate Action Plan and subsequent versions of that. So there's been this long-term kind of engagement in that topic. So with that, I want to just move into it because we're running a little late. Dr. Paul Loiketh, Associate Professor in the Department of Geography, his PhD in Rutgers and focused on weather and climate extremes. And today he's really going to kind of frame out kind of some of the trends around climate that we're seeing within our region to give us kind of a broad understanding of kind of how climate is changing. And what our region might expect. It'll be kind of a foregrounding or backgrounding for what Dr. Shondas will then talk about, which is looking a bit more granularly at what's happening in the urban form and different ways we could think about urban form and climate. So with that, I'll pass it over to Paul, and Paul, you just let me know when I need to advance the slides.
Sure, and Fletcher, I think you still have it in notes so that we see your notes as opposed to the primary slide. Actually, this would work okay too.
Let me just try it one more time here. I got an idea. Take that off and do this. Is that better?
Yes.
Okay.
All right. Thanks, Fletcher. And hi, everybody. So as Fletcher just said, I'm going to give kind of an overview of observed trends and a couple of climate variables and our best understanding of future projections in those. And I realize that some of this is probably very much review for many of us, but we also, I think a couple weeks ago when the three of us joined the meeting, there was some interest in talking about getting maybe better understanding of the future outlook and future projections. So I put together just sort of some of the basics and fundamentals and organized it into what we've been seeing in the observations and what the science tells us about going forward. So we can go to the next slide. And I broke it down into temperature, precipitation, and then this idea of combined or concurrent extremes of smoke and heat, which came up last meeting when we were there. So I'll talk just briefly about that. So we'll look at the historical trends. So starting here with temperature, then we'll look at future projections, and we'll also look at kind of the averages and then the extremes in both of those as well. So there's a bunch of charts on here, and I don't want to go through the details of everything, but what I did was pull the observational record for temperature for, this is Portland Airport, so records go back to 1939. And on the top, there's three graphs. On the left, it's the annual average temperature, so the entire year averaged together, and each dot on that graph is 1 year's worth of temperature. And then there's a blue line fitted to the trend. So you can see very clearly temperature in Portland has been increasing. But there's lots of year-to-year variability, and 2015 stands out still as the hottest year on record in Portland. And I believe that's true statewide and probably region-wide as well. And then broke it down into if you do this on the daytime maximum temperature and the nighttime minimum temperature. I thought this was really interesting, worth pointing out. You can see by the slope of the trend line that the slope is much steeper on the right for the daily minimum temperature for the blue graph. And what that's saying is that nighttime temperatures are warming faster in Portland than daytime temperatures, actually by quite a bit. So the trend is 0.3 degrees Fahrenheit per decade for minimum temperatures, but it's only 0.1 degrees Fahrenheit per decade for maximum temperatures. So when you average those together, you get what's in orange on the left. Then I also broke it out by season because we have an interesting seasonality in Portland and our warming trends. Our summers are warming much faster than our winters. And that's not true everywhere on Earth, but it is true in Portland. So the bottom left is showing just summer temperature, which is defined as the months of June, July, and August. And the warming trend there is 0.3 degrees Fahrenheit per decade. But in winter, the trend is only 0.1 degree Fahrenheit per decade. So we've seen in the historical past a more rapid or greater increase in temperature in the summer than in the winter. And that increase in temperature that we see there is almost entirely attributable to anthropogenic climate warming. So we go to the next slide. And looking at temperature in the future, this is looking at it in a map format, but these are projections of future temperature. This is from the 4th Oregon Climate Assessment Report, and the 5th report is actually being written right now. So I think every 2 years, Oregon issues one of these. So this is showing sort of the best estimate that we have of how temperature will increase across, in this case, the Western US, under an assumption of continued increases in greenhouse gases by the mid-21st century, compared to the late 20th century. And the brighter the reds on the map, the greater the warming that's projected. And the top left, the DJF, that's the months. That's December, January, and February. So that's winter. And panel B is the spring. Panel C is the summer. And panel D is the fall. And one thing that really stands out is that across the whole West, there's greater, the warming rate is greater, the amount of warming is greater in the summer compared to the cooler months. But you can also see, if you identify where Portland is, in the summer, it's kind of in this gradient where towards the coast, warming is really kind of reduced or mitigated by the ocean effect on temperature, which keeps the warming from being as great. And to our interior, the warming is much greater. So Portland's kind of in between an area that's projected to see more modest amounts of warming and an area that's projected to see more extreme amounts of warming. Regardless, the consensus from these maps here shows by the mid-21st century of summer warming by an additional 3 to 4 degrees compared to the late 20th century. So that's considerable amount of warming. And if we looked out to 2100, we would see that increase more under these assumptions of increases in greenhouse gases. So some of that 3 to 4 degrees of warming we've already experienced. We go to the next slide. Extreme temperatures. So this is thinking about the coldest days and the warmest days, coldest nights and the warmest nights. And there's a lot of information on these charts. What I really want to sort of bring home, this I think is super interesting, and I wish I could have updated this to this week, because we've now broken eight record warm nights in Portland in the last 2 weeks. Our nighttime record temperatures are being broken at a really fast rate. And what this graph on the left-hand side shows with the red line is the number of record warm nights per year. So the higher up that red line is, the more records are standing in that year. And you can see that in recent years, our warmest nights on record have been really increasing. And then the blue line is our coldest nights on record. And we still do break record cold temperatures. It does happen. We broke a few last year, but most of those records are from earlier in the record, back in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. If we look on the right-hand side, it's the same thing, but for record warm and cold days. And there's really no trend in either record warm or cold days. So you can see 2015 really stands out with that red line. That was a huge number of record highs broken. But generally speaking, we're seeing this trend in the increase in record warm temperature in the city of Portland being more common and more frequent for our nighttime low temperatures than for our daytime high temperatures. And it's pretty interesting. I think this red line on the left will be even more dramatic when I can update this with the last couple of weeks. I have 8 record highs or 8 record warm days of any kind in 2 weeks is pretty notable. We don't pay attention to record warm nights very often because it just doesn't seem that impactful this time of year, but it is telling about what's going on as far as our temperatures. We go to the next slide. And then another way we can look at extreme warm temperatures is the number of 90-degree or warmer days per year in Portland, and that's what this graph shows. So there's tons of ups and downs, so year-to-year variability is really high. But overall, there's been a pretty considerable increasing trend in the number of days that Portland experiences each year that are over 90 degrees. We see eight more days above 90 degrees now than we did in the mid-20th century. So that's a pretty large increase. The past 2 years really haven't been all that dramatic, but if we look at the graph, we can see 2018 was the record with 31 days. 2015 was just below that. Go to the next slide. So this is one measure of future projections of extreme heat in Portland. This is showing the projected change in days with the heat index above 90 degrees Fahrenheit. So heat index includes humidity. It's a combined variable, but because our heat does not come with humidity in the Northwest, this is pretty much what the projection of days above 90 degrees would be. So the heat index is negligible or sometimes actually negative in the Northwest. So we can just ignore that this is a heat index. Just consider this projections of days greater than 90 degrees. And this is by the mid-21st century, so not too far from now. This shows an increase of 26.5 days above 90 degrees compared to the late 20th century. This is by the mid-21st century. So we've seen 8-degree increase. This is telling us that that increasing trend is very likely to continue or accelerate in the number of 90-degree plus days. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, onto precipitation. There's a lot less to talk about with precipitation. This is very similar to what I showed for temperature, but it's broken down by season. So the top three panels, we have annual fall total rainfall on the left, winter in the middle, and spring on the right. And then that blue line shows the trend. And if we look at fall rainfall, that trend is pretty close to zero. There's lots of year-to-year variability. We have dry years, we have wet years, but there's really no trend there. If we look at winter rainfall, there's maybe a slightly drying trend, but that's really small and probably not significant. And if we look at spring, there's a small increasing trend. I also think that's probably not significant. In fact, we've had the last 3 springs, you can see by the 3 green dots furthest to the right on the spring rainfall chart were really dry. If we look at just the water year, which goes October to September, on the bottom left, that's kind of like our annual rainfall. There's been essentially zero trend. So we really haven't seen any change in our rainfall when you look at the overall amount that falls out of the sky. If we go to the next slide, if we look at some measures of extremes, and there's a lot of ways to do this. This is not a completely inclusive view on how we can look at extremes, but it gives us an idea. On the left is the number of days in each year that had over 1 inch of rain, so kind of a heavy rain day. There's a small decreasing trend in the number of days with 1 inch of rain or greater, although again, it's probably not really a significant trend. But the trend line is a little faint on there, is slightly going down. And on the right-hand side, it's the average rainfall rate for each year in inches. So what that's saying is that every day that rained in each year, what was the average intensity of that rainfall over the course of the day? So the daily intensity of rainfall actually has been decreasing in Portland. Again, I don't think that's probably climate change related or anything really particularly significant, but sometimes I hear kind of anecdotally that rainfall rate is increasing or we're getting more extremes, and the observational record doesn't really support that in the city of Portland. If we're talking about the globe, or we're talking about the East Coast, or we're talking about the lower Mississippi River Valley, it would be a different story. But this is really just specific to what we've seen in the city of Portland. Okay, on the next slide, please. So looking at precipitation in the future, this is broken down by season, where the top left is winter, the top right is spring, the bottom left is summer, and the bottom right is fall. And then I've clicked on the on a point just by Portland to get a specific idea of the values. By the mid-21st century, this shows, oops, sorry, it's okay. For winter, maybe a modest or small increase in the amount of rainfall. In the spring, pretty much no change. In the summer, a more substantial decrease in rainfall. But again, our summers are already really dry, so a 15% decrease in rainfall when you already get very little isn't maybe all that much. And then in fall, not much change either. When we're talking about projections of future rainfall, though, it's important to note this is averaging solutions from a large number of climate models, which is a common thing that we do in climate science because climate models all have slightly different sensitivities and they use different assumptions to tell us what's likely to happen in the future. And for the area where Portland is and the part of the Pacific Northwest around us in Portland, if you looked at individual models, you'd see some that say it's going to get wetter, some that say it's going to get drier, some that say there's not going to be much change. And when you average them all together, this is kind of what you get. So the confidence in precipitation projections is a little bit lower than when we talk about temperature here in Portland. But this is sort of the consensus. If we go to the next slide. So I don't have any graphs or charts about extreme precipitation in the future. It wasn't as easy to pull from the Oregon Climate Assessment Report. They have some language on it. And it's kind of a mixed bag when we talk about projections of future extreme precipitation, but the consensus is kind of that there, at least in the Portland area, there probably won't be a really notable increase or decrease or change in the amount of precipitation that falls in the most extreme events. That's not true globally when we talk about climate change's effect on extreme precipitation globally or in other parts of the world. Certainly extreme precipitation is getting more extreme, but there are some meteorological reasons that help explain why that isn't quite so clear in the Portland area. But I want to point out, so there's some uncertainty in those statements. Just like I said about precipitation, the kind of projections kind of span of range. But it's also important to note when thinking about, since we're talking about planning, that we get extreme rainfall events that are very impactful. And we have in the past, thinking to like 1996, the Vanport floods and some big floods even further back in history. So regardless of where the sort of consensus falls here on extreme precipitation in the future, I just want to make it clear that extreme precipitation events will continue to happen and be really impactful. So being resilient to that, I think is an important thing to keep in mind, no matter where the consensus falls here. Nothing is saying that we're going to stop getting extreme precipitation events. Next slide, please. And then snowfall sometimes gets talked about, and I thought it'd just be interesting to put this on, just to talk about it really briefly. So on the left is the amount of snowfall in Portland each year going back to 1940. And you can see there's been a pretty steady, although it's gradual decline in the amount of snowfall we get. And the reason for that's pretty straightforward. Portland's not a very cold place. When we do get snow, it's often kind of marginal for temperature anyway. It's usually almost rain. So a little bit of warming turns those snow events into rain pretty easily. So I think we can be pretty confident that going forward in the future, snow will become less and less of an issue in Portland. However, we will still continue to get snowstorms for the time being, even though they will gradually become less and less common. So we've had impactful snowstorms in the past couple of years. You can see that those don't stand out on this graph as being particularly snowy years compared to what the mid-20th century experienced. But snow is impactful no matter what in the city of Portland, and snow won't just all of a sudden disappear, but it will gradually become less and less common as temperatures warm. Remember, winter's warming more slowly than summer, so that warming isn't happening quite at the rate as other times of the year. So snow can hang in there. Okay, next slide.
We got about a couple more minutes.
Okay, I'll be really quick on this. This is just talking about the co-occurrence of heat and smoke, which came up in the last meeting. And I think it's a really good point because the weather conditions that tend to cause there to be smoke in Portland are often also the weather conditions that tend to cause it to be hot in Portland. So smoke is usually being produced by fires that are inland of Portland. And when we get air from the interior of the Northwest, that tends to be hot air because it doesn't have the cooling effect of the Pacific Ocean. And if there are fires, it's also going to be smoky air. So oftentimes when we get smoky air in the city of Portland, it's also a weather pattern that brings us hot temperatures, and that can exacerbate the effects on human health. Of course, that can require air conditioning and people to stay inside in order to protect their health and safety, which brings up all kinds of issues. So I think as wildfires continue to become more common, smoky summers are more common, the co-occurrence of heat and smoke is something that is concerning for Portland specifically. So maybe I won't go over the conclusions. If we go to the next slide too carefully. I did put a slide in here just sort of noting some of the work that we've been doing in my lab with BES and the Water Bureau, looking at weather patterns associated with extremes. It's way more than we need to go into, I think, in detail or have time to go into, but I'd be happy to talk about that. And we do have reports that are available from those projects. And then I have a couple summary slides. I just want to, with the summary slides, if we can go to maybe the last one. I think warming temperatures provide the most pressing challenge related to climate change in Portland. And I hope I kind of made that case by what we were showing here. And but this co-occurrence of warming temperatures and air quality could also be an issue. And I think this is kind of a good transition over to the heat discussion from Vivek. So hopefully it didn't take too long.
Great. Thank you, Paul. Yeah, sorry, just wanted to make sure we had time. And then I'll also just note, and I didn't really do it in my introduction, but part of the reason why I really wanted to bring Paul and Vivek to this group is that they've both had a long history of collaborating with different city bureaus. And so as Paul mentioned, there's some deep work he's done with the Water Bureau and BES that we can dive into after this if people are interested. But I'll go over, and I'll keep this brief, but Dr. Vivek Shandas, I've known Vivek as long as I've been at PSU, and he's done just a variety of different engagements with the city of Portland, and a lot of his work has really centered on this place. And a lot of his work is also looking at the intersection of land use and climate. And so I thought you'd be a great person to bring here. And once again, some of you have seen his work, and we'll just dive back into it. But Vivek, it's all you.
Thanks, Fletcher. Thanks PSE and staff. Feels like I'm talking to you a lot lately. I've been coming in more often than I'm probably going to my class. But it's great to see you all. I'm glad to be here. Just following up with Paul's great overview. I mean, Paul works at scales that I can hardly comprehend. My mind is trying to wrap around the fact that he can do this stuff, multiple climate-induced stressors across a massive geography, and it requires a tremendous amount of not only kind of analytical skill, computational skill, also kind of logical skill in terms of being able to piece together all the multiple parts. So really grateful to be able to work with someone like Paul on some of this work. As you know, you've all committed to this. I mean, you put a climate plan together that won some pretty amazing awards internationally. You've committed to a number of different aspects of being able to make Portland one of these incredibly climate-friendly places. It's also the Pacific Northwest identified as a place as a climate haven. There's books now coming out on this. It's poised to, you're all poised to really be in a position to move some pretty interesting and important work in this area. And so I just remind you of that. This 2020 plan coming out, I understand, and I'm also working with the folks at DLCD and OHA and various state agencies to try to work through the executive order that's been pushed through by the governor, and lots of action on this right now. And it feels like we're really seeing Californians recognize that California has been hit by some pretty severe events this year, and who knows what that might mean for population growth next year, and so on. So the way Portland grows is really going to lend itself to this question of heat, question of how we manage some of these climate-induced stressors. And I just want to go through a few slides here. If you go to the next one, Fletcher, just want to remind you that there are, you've got all these maps already. I've sent the ones that we've generated about heat to you, and you've got work that's happened on the multifamily dwelling, residential dwellings and mixed use, and the historic discussion that historic areas discussion that you had really ties in together with this as well, because what we're partly talking about is trying to bring together these climate-induced stressors that we can now fortunately describe with a pretty high level of precision with the on-the-ground conditions that you're all working with and trying to revise, modify, and give permits for. And so this lends itself to questions of who's living in these areas, what does this mean? And I just want to kind of before I get into some of the data side of it, just want to kind of reflect on this, that this means people are walking in some of these hot areas. And if we're seeing temperatures increase, 4 to 5 degrees may not seem like a lot, but that's on average, keep in mind. And that's averaged across a massive time and spatial resolution. And so we're really talking about these things varying by upwards of 15, 18 degrees in some cases, depending on what's on the ground. And so when we think about, particularly if you go to the next Fletcher, I probably put too many animations in this, but really we looked at some work on who's exposed to some of these hottest areas during the nighttime when temperatures are really hot and they don't cool down. So these are communities. We're not a region that has a very high level of AC, air conditioning, and so this really lends itself to what's it like outside your home and who's being affected. And we're seeing the pretty classic trend here. We're seeing those with lower formal education, higher levels of diversity, neighborhoods with higher diversity, extreme poverty, white communities having more access to central AC, and Asian and older communities having less access to heat refuges that the county actually administers from time to time. And so this is work that we've been deep into and trying to kind of bring Portland into this agenda of trying to manage this very proactively, because as we're seeing from Paul's models and others' models, it's not going to get any cooler. And that creates a double whammy, if you will. Go to the next slide, Fletcher, where you see headlines, which when I was talking to some folks at BPS and elsewhere about front page news about Portland being a top of a list, this isn't the list you want to be on top of. This is basically showing, what you've seen. Saw Sandra present earlier on the redlined areas and the report that you had commissioned that came out, I think, last year, the year before, on historically redlined areas in relation to various zoning ordinances and recentering historically disinvested communities in this work. And so what we're finding is pretty consistent that this is really a serious issue, because we're finding that those redlined areas are very coterminous with some of the hottest areas in the city as well. And so that got us really thinking into, if you go to the next slide, really got us thinking into which communities are most disproportionately affected. And often we find that places that have multifamily residential developments, places that are what's posed, at least in the recently adopted comprehensive plan, what areas is the city really looking to grow, and what are the specific areas that are going to be rezoned? And this missing middle housing has come up a lot, and the idea that there are some very dense, there are some very very less dense areas of the city, and as we think about residential infill development, we think about better housing by design, we think about these plans, we're seeing an area that's going to get a lot more dense. That's fantastic. And it's something that I think we're all really looking to examine when it comes to these climate-induced stressors. So working with your design team and working with some models, if you go to the next slide, we started asking these questions about density without heat. And while we can couple these developments into the sewer system, into the existing pipe network, and with Bureau of Environmental Services really examining over the last almost 15 years, 20 years, all the pipe system in the city, we wanted to understand whether this would have an equivalent effect on heat in the city. So we used a modeling software that we've had access to called NVMet to essentially take an existing base case in Portland, simulate it with two extremes. One extreme of saying, what if you were to really increase the level of asphalt here and really remove a lot of the green spaces in this space? And then what if you were to increase all the different combinations of albedo, meaning reflectivity, green space, and kind of use the other extreme, and seeing what would that mean in terms of a city for different types of land covers in this case, as it's linked to specific land uses. So we took these three scenarios, and if you go to the next slide, we tried them out on several different types of neighborhoods. And so this is one example where we took a high canopy residential neighborhood, and we looked at those two extreme scenarios. If you go to the next slide, and what we're able to see, and I'll just walk through this with you really quickly, but what we really want to look at is, here's the base case on the left. It's digitized. That's why it looks kind of pixelated in the model. The middle sim 1 is a simulation 1 where we've essentially taken one extreme version of putting asphalt down in this area, like a lot of parking lots and a lot of development. And then the other case where we're greening and addressing, putting in, increasing reflectivity, and really trying to maximize the amount of potential cooling that could happen. And what we're noticing when we run these models, what we notice is temperature differentials. And what you can see here is essentially the base case to the asphalt is about a 13-degree Fahrenheit difference in temperature. So that's really probably the envelope that we're working with here. Whereas greening an already high canopy neighborhood doesn't reduce the temperature a great deal. If we go to the next slide, we can go through this, a few of these that I want to just illustrate the connection between what we're doing on the landscape and the potential implications on amplifying local temperatures. If you take an urban district, and you can see this in terms of the digitized version of it on the right side here, and we're trying to think about what could we do in this particular location, because there's not much space for doing anything more than essentially trying to change small little bits here and there. And so if you go to the next slide, what we can see is if we take that base case and we green it up a little bit along the edges, sidewalks, we see a decrease in temperature about 2 degrees Fahrenheit here. And if we create more asphalt and remove what's there, the model suggests about a little over almost 4-degree increase in Fahrenheit on average for the city block. And so we take this down a couple more. If you go to another scenario where we looked at a large lot neighborhood, and this was one we did several scenarios in. I'm only going to show you a couple here, where we essentially did the 2 extremes. We also tried to change this from 16 to 64 units and tucked in parking, did various different designs on this to see which one could maintain temperatures. And we were able to find some that could actually see the increase in density while maintaining pre-development, or in some cases actually even lower temperatures than the existing 16-unit development temperatures. And so that was but believe it or not, for kind of analytical wonks like me, it really is amazing when you can try to do this in a model, because it's really hard to kind of simulate this, of course, in real life, because these real world examples don't come along very easily. And so we took this large lot neighborhood, and if you go to the next slide, and we did the 2 extremes, and we saw about a 6-degree increase when you kind of pave it over, if you will, or a little decrease of about 3 degrees Fahrenheit on average, if you were to install at least a few of the potential greening scenarios. And then if you go to the last one, this last industrial neighborhood where we see a lot in the Central East Side, possibly up in North Portland, Marine Drive, et cetera. What we start seeing, what we're trying to do here is essentially take this and seeing what is possible with this. And so if you go to the next slide, when we pave it over, do anything change to it, we don't see even a degree change in this Fahrenheit. Whereas even a little bit of greening and even changing the roof albedo is able to reduce it about 2 degrees. And so all in all, if you go to the last slide, what we're really getting at, oops, I'm sorry, I lied. One more is a semi-rural where we have really distributed land use. And these are all right out of the city's fabric, land use fabric. And if you go to the next slide and you take the 2 extremes, we take a high canopy, similar neighborhood, and we pave it over. We're essentially seeing about a 9-degree increase in temperature and about a 6-degree decrease in temperature with some modifications to it. And so when you sum all this up in this slide, you can kind of see if you just take these 2 extremes as a way to be illustrative about what we're doing to this landscape, there really are different ways that we can think about different land uses as well as different treatments that they could that we have some capacity, or you all really have some capacity to address. And so while greening may not work the same across all of these because of space limitations, or even because of owner limitations, or even code limitations, there are effects that we can try to play out in different ways. If we're thinking about kind of this classic land use development process where we're essentially permitting development to happen as it always has, that really isn't meeting some of these future projections that Paul and others are identifying in this region. So if you go to the last slide, we took these scenarios and we tried to take these and put it on I put this on a little slider thing that I don't have time to show, but you can essentially look at one neighborhood, the one highlighted in white here, and you can essentially take these land uses, do these different treatments where you're paving it over, you're greening it, and we can essentially see differences of about 25 degrees Fahrenheit in this one neighborhood if you were to go from green to gray. And that allows us to get a better handle on what's possible, what's kind of the envelope we're talking about in some of these areas, and particularly those areas that have been, again, historically disinvested, that are in residences that have multifamily often, that have communities that may not have access to or be able to run an air conditioning unit. And so these are some become some pretty serious equity considerations that we want to start bringing into consideration. And while PSEF and other programs could help in addressing some of these, I think there's a more fundamental upstream goal here in terms of what code can do and what policy can do. So I leave you with this one last question in the next slide, and just really thinking about, with so many different options, which one will we support in terms of trying to think about increasing density here? This last little image on the bottom right of this slide, it was from a paper last year in Nature Communications, which essentially showed these climate analogs of what Portland might be like in 2080. And they did this for about 578 cities across North America. And it was interesting to see Portland being more like kind of Sacramento or that paradise region of California, where fires are a very common thing, where heat creates large impacts across large spaces, and that we also see kind of a time for us to kind of think about this in the next 20, 40, 60, 80 years, to really have a little bit of a runway to start making these amendments now, so that what we're seeing with our neighbors to the south may not be a reality that we have to endure. And so we really have a little bit of, we have the grace of time on our side, although it's still upon us, as Paul's already shown us, and trying to find ways to do this well and get ahead of this curve, I think, is really where we are right now. And I'd love to work with you all. And I know Paul and Fletcher have kind of brought this up in trying to find ways to better integrate the land use local level stuff with these kind of more macro perspectives of what we're anticipating. So I'll leave it at that and just open it up to any questions.
Thanks, Vivek. Real quick, the slide you showed here, is this on the Super Lab? Is this something that people can access, Vivek?
Yeah, I have a link to that. Okay. I'll have to send it around. I don't have it right here, but yeah, I have a link to that I can send around and show folks if you're interested.
Awesome.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Fletcher and Dr. Loketh and Dr. Chandras. And we started about 10 minutes late with you, so I'm hoping folks will indulge us, go maybe 10 minutes late with question and answer if we have them. So let me see what hands are up, and we'll start with the questions. So Mike, yours first, and then Kat will be next.
Yeah, great presentation. I was shocked, however, to see the data which suggests there will not necessarily, I mean, we will have intense rain events. Bureau of Environmental Services for quite some time has asserted that we're going to see increasing intensity events. And so that's contrary to what we heard today. So I was just surprised at that. I've got a whole bunch of questions that I will follow up in deference to time with emails. I'll leave it at that for now. Anyway, great presentation, appreciate it.
Thank you. Kat.
Yes, thank you. That was very interesting. I just had a quick question on, as you were kind of analyzing the different neighborhoods and the greening of those different neighborhoods, you talked a little bit that you seem to have a toggle in there for roof albedo. Does that also include options for eco roofs and how those are affected? Were those in those analyses you were using? So I guess just generally just address that. That'd be helpful for me.
Sure. Just really quick on that. It's a question that comes up a fair bit, partly because of the Central City Eco Roof, et cetera, and also other regions like Chicago we worked with to try to figure out what might work well. And it depends on kind of what your goals partly are. If you're looking to improve the ambient environment of walking around the streets in specific areas, we haven't seen much of an effect, at least from the models of human, like on the ground level exposure from an eco roof that's sometimes 10 meters or 5 meters, 10 meters, 20 meters up. It does though, when you look at satellite imagery of heat, you do see that immediate effect. So a lot of planners are like, oh yeah, eco roofs, way to go, it'll cool the entire neighborhood, when really it might be helpful in terms of energy costs for a building. It might be helpful in terms of stormwater mitigation. It might be helpful for other co-benefits, if you will. Though if your goal is to kind of reduce the exposure down on the ground, then it might not play as direct of a contribution. At least that's what we're seeing in some of these models.
Okay, thank you. Jeff, and then I've got a question after you.
Okay, thank you. I'm still without video, so I'm assuming you can hear me okay?
Making up for in quantity, you're on the screen twice right now.
I can't figure out what I did. Anyway. My one question is, if a key goal is, I'm not sure of the terminology, but we have communities in Portland that are negatively impacted by the heat island effect. You said several times one key difference you're seeing between the more affluent communities and the less affluent is air conditioners. I'm wondering, is anyone trying programs where you subsidize the placement of air conditioning in these units, whether it's retrofitting or new construction, and how much sort of cost-effective benefit would that do?
Yeah, lots of thoughts on this. I mean, there are New York City, various other, even Washington County right now is giving away air conditioners to communities. I mean, they were in the middle of the summer during heat waves. So there are lots of programs in terms of getting the short-term benefit of getting air conditioning. I still think like that's a Band-Aid on the issue of something that's a little more systemic that we need to, that is my interest in kind of working with you all on, is trying to get at the idea we're building in a way where we actually know that there is an effect of the way we're building on the temperatures we're experiencing. And if we're continuing to say that temperatures are going to go up, they have already gone up, and we are going to see communities that have been disinvested be hit hardest from those. And we're going to see that on a if we have a 2-week heat wave, say above 90, above 100 degrees, like unheard of in the region, but say something like that happens, we'll see mortality rates really go through the roof, and Portland will be top of the list again. And it's like, that's something that I think a lot of us are really concerned about. And working now across the country, people keep asking me like, what's the city doing in terms of heat? You're right there. You're working with Washington, DC, Richmond, Austin, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, they're working on it. Let me find out more. We're working on it. And I'd love to go back with something to actually tell other communities of how we've been able to center marginalized communities in this that are affected, and yet put it into code in such a way that we can actually move this more effectively. Vancouver, Surrey, British Columbia are trying with the air conditioning piece as well, but they're still relatively early and trying to work with developers more directly to see if that's a subsidy that will make sense. And so that's an ongoing conversation right now.
Thank you. Thanks for the presentation. It's depressing sometimes, the global impacts of climate, and yet with the stuff you're studying, it's really local. We have local control over it, and zoning is also local. So it's encouraging that we actually have some tools at our disposal to help address local heat island effects. So I want to home in on the tree question. In your models, you showed different levels of trees, but of course in practical purposes, some trees are on public property and some are on private property, streets and private property, and we regulate them quite differently in Portland. Do you have any sense of how much of the opportunity to reduce heat island is with regard to trees on private land versus the right-of-way?
With them, we haven't done that. Short answer is no. I can't tell you directly. Although with the logical playbook of saying that if the majority of land is in private hands, there is a role to play in terms of being able to increase tree canopy in private areas, though that comes down to a much more of a local preference, local, a lot of questions about the property owner of that particular parcel. And so and particularly in multifamily residential, that gets even more wicked. It gets to a point where it's negotiating that with multifamily residential property owners. I haven't had much luck with, at least in my role on the planning, on the Urban Forestry Commission. So it becomes much more than let's do a free tree giveaway thing, and guess who takes all the free trees and guess who puts them in, right? It's the people who show up often and don't have the time and have the resources. And so that becomes a really hard question in terms of then making it a voluntary thing. It becomes then a public good and a way of being able to use the capacity of public agencies to try to move it in the public realm and in the public spaces. And that of course, we're trying to work on many different fronts, from Parks and Rec to this commission, et cetera.
Thanks. Oriana, and then Mike.
I have a question for Dr. Chandas and actually a response to Jeff, because I've done a little bit of work on the air conditioner front. I'm wondering if I could get permission to share my screen, because I actually have a map generated by BPS for a different project that can show kind of where central air is located in the city. And it's pretty striking. While that's getting toggled, I think a request than a question would be for PSU and in particular Dr. Chandas to share some of the work on outdoor and indoor air quality, COVID and zoning that's been done, because I think the story is not just about the heat island effect, but also about that co-occurrence of poor air quality in communities and general impacts on health for communities that are most impacted by the climate crisis and most impacted by entities that are contributing to the climate crisis through emissions. And I think Cali, where Verde operates, is certainly one of those communities that is impacted both by the heat island effect and by the air quality effect. And then this map was created for the Zero Cities project. It was actually created by Tony Lamb. And we used it to compare to the heat island effect map by thinking about where are there places where people can get relief from heat. All the little orange dots are central air conditioning. The green are parks. We have environmental zones identified as well. And I think what's really striking to me is just how the concentration in places like Selwood, Moreland, and Irvington of central areas versus how little there is in East Portland, how little there is in Portsmouth, New Columbia, which is around where I live, in certain parts of Northeast Portland, like Cully. So while I agree with Dr. Chandas that I think the systemic issue and the systematic issues are the ones we need to address, I think a lot could be addressed as well by looking at programs, not just to distribute air conditioners, but to distribute ductless heat pumps. And that's particularly important as we have more significant fire seasons. Because in the Zero Cities project, when we did a survey of community about heating and cooling, we found that a lot of people had left their windows open during the Eagle Creek fire. And so from an air quality perspective, community was deeply impacted because they didn't have air conditioning, and air conditioning doesn't have air purification attached to it, but ductless heat pumps do. So I think thinking about not only how do we address heating and cooling but also how we address indoor and outdoor air quality and the interactions between the two will become more and more crucial. And I think it's just been so crucial during this COVID year when the cooling centers haven't been open and when many people didn't have access to air purification during the fires in September. And I'm happy to share that map around with folks if people want to explore it further.
Eli, I just wanted to mention, though, I think Vivek and Paul both have 3 o'clock they need to get to. I just wanted to check with you guys about that. Because I know they've moved some things around.
I could manage another minute or two if there's a question, but I do have to.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. If you got to run to a meeting, Mike, do you have a very quick question?
I do. Jeff's question goes right to the heart of how we do plan for the future. Do we take a structural engineered approach, or do we focus on green infrastructure? And for Fletcher, we've been talking for 2 to 3 years now about the city strategy around green infrastructure. And I think it would be great for the next presentation we hear from you is what exactly does that GI plan entail with regard to alternatives? Now, not to say people shouldn't have the opportunity to have an air conditioner, but there are other ways with regard to urban forest canopy, with how residences are designed that don't necessarily rely on high energy intensive air conditioning. So I'd really like to hear more about the overall green infrastructure strategy that you've been working with the Bureau of Environmental Services.
Well, as I've been going through this, I've been taking notes. And Oriana, your thoughts about the cascading disasters, I think, is even more and more relevant. And I do think maybe a future presentation with a faculty member, Jola Ajubate, who's been studying this specifically, would be really interesting. We're looking at the confounding factors that start to happen when a lot of these disasters stack on each other. And just as you said, smoke plus cooling being a really big one. If you look at what Paul has also said in his presentations about that being a factor that's just going to get worse over time. It's already bad. But
all right, well, thank you so much. And I think that this may be a good way to close and to say we appreciate PSU for helping us out on this and hope you'll be a resource as we have questions going forward, which we already do, as you can tell. So
yeah, we definitely will. Just send us an email, and we'll if you have any further questions, let us know, and we'll be happy to get back and come talk with you all more.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right.
Cheers.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
All right. Well, with that, we will close our meeting. Our next meeting will be in a couple weeks, and we'll be hearing public testimony again on the Historic Resources Project. Try and carve out some more time for question and answer. Brandon can't answer them all in the interim, and an update on the Albina vision. So thank you, everyone. We are adjourned.